Hi guys, tonight we're going on a journey through time. A slow, quiet journey into the long-forgotten world of the medieval peasantry, a time when the nights were colder, the winters harsher, and survival, though often humble and silent, was a feat of cleverness, strength, and ancient tradition. In this story, told gently and in 24 soft chapters, we'll explore how medieval peasants lived through the coldest nights, what secrets they passed from generation to generation, and what daily life felt like when firelight was the only light, and every breath in winter steamed into the air like a ghost. We begin on a crisp evening, in a small village nestled deep in the English countryside. The year is 1326, and the frost is already beginning to nibble at the edges of thatched rooftops. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a smear of red across the sky. Already the chill began creeping through the small village of Dunworth like an uninvited guest. Smoke curled up lazily from crooked chimneys, the fires inside struggling to warm the cramped cottages. The earth was hard underfoot, stiffened by the frost of the day before, and the air held that unmistakable weight of a coming deep freeze. In one of the cottages, no larger than a modern garden shed, a family of 5 prepared for the long night ahead. The father, Wilfred, thickly bearded and broad-shouldered, had spent the day splitting firewood with a dull iron axe. His hands were calloused, red and cracked from the cold. His wife, Ellen, small and stout, moved like a ghost through the dim interior, tucking wool scraps into the cracks of the shutters to stop the drafts. Their 3 children huddled near the hearth, whispering and watching the stew bubble slowly in a blackened iron pot. This was survival, medieval style. There was no insulation, no central heating, no thick glass windows or wool-lined jackets from a store, just earth, fire, wool and tradition. The home itself was built from wattle and daub, wooden latticework plastered with a mixture of clay, straw and manure. The roof was thatched, and in winter thatch was both a blessing and a curse. It trapped some warmth inside, but mice often nested in the dry straw, and occasionally a light snowfall might cause a corner to sag inwards, letting the cold seep through the cracked structure. There were no doors as we know them, just rough wooden boards or animal skins tied in place to keep the wind at bay. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed wool and damp earth. Yet this was comfort to them. This was safety. As the stew thickened, Ellen set about her evening ritual. She stirred in dried peas, bits of onion, and a sliver of preserved pork, precious and rare, saved from the autumn slaughter. Over the hearth, on a swinging iron hook, the pot hissed and bubbled. The children, Marjorie, Thomas, and little Edda, watched with wide eyes. They were not hungry yet, but the warmth of the pot was a silent promise against the bitter night. Wilfred returned with a final armful of wood, stacking it with practiced precision beside the hearth. He gave a brief nod to Ellen, then knelt to pull off his boots, caked in icy mud. With thick woolen socks that Ellen had spun last spring, he stepped to the fire and let the warmth kiss his tired feet. There was no luxury, but there was rhythm. And rhythm, in its own way, is a kind of comfort. The children shared a single cot, stuffed with straw and covered in coarse linen and wool blankets. The parents slept on a bed no bigger than a modern twin, its mattress made from sacks filled with dried rushes. Before sleeping, they would all press close together, like rabbits in a burrow, pulling every thread of wool they owned across their bodies, conserving precious heat. It was not unusual for peasants to sleep in their day clothes. They owned perhaps 2 sets, one for daily work and one for holy days. There were no changing rooms, no pajamas. Your clothes were your warmth, your protection. If you were lucky, you had a woolen cloak, perhaps lined with sheepskin if a generous tanner had traded with your village. Underneath the children's cot, 2 chickens slept in a wicker basket. And beyond them, near the low wooden door, the family's only pig grunted softly, its warmth adding to the room. Animals were not simply livestock. In winter they were heaters, living, breathing sources of warmth. Their breath mingled with the humans. Their bodies added to the collective heat. And in return they were treated well, because a warm pig in winter might be the difference between frostbite and survival. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. It whispered past the narrow windows, little more than holes covered in greased linen or stretched bladder. Glass was a fantasy. Even nobles rarely had real glass panes. The linen kept the wind from cutting through entirely, but it gave the room a dim, filtered look, even by day. By night, the only light came from the fire. Candles were made from tallow, animal fat, and though they were cheap to produce, they stank. Most peasants saved them for emergencies or holy nights. On a regular evening like this, the family relied on firelight and moonlight. Shapes danced on the walls, shifting with every flicker of the hearth. Dinner was served with wooden spoons, straight from the pot. There were no plates, no napkins, just shared warmth, shared food, and the satisfaction of silence. The children ate greedily, though they understood instinctively not to take too much. Winter was long, and the larder was not bottomless. After the meal, Ellen added dried herbs to the fire, lavender and rosemary, saved from the summer harvest, not for fragrance, but to purify the air. Illness was feared above all, and in winter it came easily. Cold homes bred coughs. A single fever could sweep through a cottage like wildfire. They did not know the names of diseases, but they knew their signs, and they feared them. As the fire dimmed and the last coals glowed red, Wilfred tucked the fire in. He covered it with ash, a technique called banking, to keep it alive through the night. In the morning they could stir the coals and bring the fire back to life without flint. The family lay down together, bodies pressed tight, breath fogged in the air, even indoors. But their heartbeats slowed, their eyes closed, and slowly sleep came. Outside, the frost thickened. But inside there was warmth, however fragile, and that was enough. By the time dawn painted the sky with the faintest hues of grey, the village of Dunworth lay under a shimmering crust of frost. The world outside had frozen in silence, as if winter had pressed its finger gently against the lips of nature and whispered, "Hush now." Icicles clung like glass teeth to the eaves of cottages, and the thatched rooftops looked powdered with flour, pale and still. Inside the small cottage, before any rooster had dared to crow, Ellen stirred. She always rose first. There was a sacred slowness to her morning routine, dictated not by clocks, but by instinct. Her breath formed tiny clouds in the gloom, and the cold stung her cheeks before she even pushed aside the blanket. She moved carefully, not just for warmth, but to avoid waking the others. Wilfred snored softly beside the children, his big body curled around them like a bear. Ida, the youngest, had her thumb in her mouth, a tiny warm bundle against her brother's side. Ellen slipped from the bed and crouched near the hearth. With careful fingers, she brushed away the layer of ash that blanketed the embers. They still glowed, a quiet promise. She reached for the iron poker and stirred gently, coaxing the fire like an old friend. A moment later, the faint crackle of life returned, and soon tiny flames licked the dried kindling she added. Warmth. Precious, subtle warmth. It wouldn't reach the corners of the room, but it would push the bite of the cold back a little. Enough to breathe without it hurting. She didn't speak. Not yet. There was a kind of reverence in the silence of early morning. Instead, she pulled her cloak tightly over her shift and padded to the wooden shelf above the hearth. From a cloth bundle, she retrieved a small loaf of rye bread, hard and dark with age, and set it by the fire to soften. It had been baked 6 days ago, still edible, but not kind to teeth. On this day, like most winter mornings, there would be no milk. The family's single cow had dried up weeks before. Ellen sometimes wondered how they'd made it through the last winter, and how they'd make it through this one. But worry was not spoken aloud. It was carried quietly, patiently, like a basket of stones. Outside, a rooster finally crowed. Wilfred stirred. He sat up, blinking at the cold, scratching his thick beard. He mumbled a low greeting, barely a word, just a rumble of voice to acknowledge her presence. Ellen nodded and poured him a ladle of warm water into a horn cup. Not tea, not ale, just heated well water with a pinch of mint. A kindness. The children woke slowly, one by one. Thomas groaned and pulled the blanket over his head. Marjorie sat up first, her hair tangled like straw, her feet tucked into her shift. Edda blinked, wide-eyed, and yawned like a kitten. There was no rush. The sun was still hiding, and the work could wait another half hour. This was the gentlest part of the day. Breakfast was simple, slices of the warmed bread dipped into leftover stew, now thick like paste. Marjorie fed Ada with a quiet patience beyond her years. She was only 8, but already bore the careful tenderness of a woman twice her age. Childhood in this time was not a sanctuary. It was a hallway, brief and narrow, leading to labour. After they ate, Wilfred pulled on his boots, now stiff from the cold. He wrapped his leather belt twice around his woolen tunic and tied it with a knot born of habit. Over it all, he pulled his cloak, a patchwork of sheepskin and rough canvas, a gift from Ellen's brother 2 winters ago, before he disappeared during the famine. Without a word, he lifted his axe and stepped outside. The cold slapped his face. The sun was barely up, just a soft orange blush behind the woods. The village was still sleeping, except for old Wren, the shepherd, who was already leading his tired dog across the frozen path toward the hills. Wilfred gave a short nod and headed toward the woodpile. Splitting logs was not just a chore, it was survival. They would burn through everything by January if he wasn't careful. He had counted the stacks, 7 neat piles, each meant to last 1 week. But even rationed, the cold stole more than expected. With each swing of the axe, he exhaled like a bellows. The sound of wood cracking echoed through the air like small thunderclaps. Every piece he split meant another hour of warmth, another night where frost wouldn't creep across the blankets. Back in the cottage, Ellen dressed the children. She folded wool wraps around Ada's arms, using scraps from an old tunic once worn by her father. Marjorie helped Thomas find his second sock. There was no playtime, no dolls or toys, but the ritual of dressing, of preparing, was a quiet comfort of its own. They would not attend school, there was no such thing, but the children still learned. Ellen taught them letters in the ash on the hearthstone. She showed them how to read the sky, how to recognize herbs, how to whisper old rhymes that warded off bad luck. By midday, the sky remained pale and heavy with cloud. Ellen stepped outside briefly to fetch water. The well stood near the centre of the village, its rope stiff and splintered with ice. She greeted the miller's wife, who was also filling her pail, wrapped in layers of linen and wool. Their voices were low, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile stillness of the season. "How many hens left?" the woman asked, not looking up. 3, Ellen replied, but one stopped laying. The woman nodded. That was all. Inside, Ellen warmed the water again and let the steam fill the room. Not for drinking this time, but for softening their hands. Cold air cracked skin like old parchment. A bowl of warm water and lard was the best remedy they knew. By afternoon, Wilfred returned with more wood, his face ruddy with wind and effort. He'd also brought something else, bundled under his arm. A dead hare caught in one of the snares he'd set near the grove. Ellen gasped quietly when she saw it, not out of fear or pity, but gratitude. Meat. A rare prize. She would stretch it into 2 meals, maybe 3, boiled first with dried peas, then again with barley if she could find some in the bottom of the sack. The children stared at it, mouths parted in wonder. They hadn't seen meat in 2 weeks. As dusk approached, the world grew quiet again. The fire was stoked. The hare was dressed and simmered with herbs. The scent filled the cottage like a song, lifting spirits in the way that only warmth and food can. Wilfred sat with Thomas, showing him how to tie a knot with rough twine, a knot that could hold a rabbit snare firm in frozen ground. Ellen hummed softly to Edda, rocking her gently near the hearth. Marjorie ran her fingers through the straw of the mattress, pulling out bits of husk and thistle. The cold was still there, but it was held at bay by these small rituals, these gestures of love and wisdom, passed down like ancient stories. And when the wind returned, scraping softly against the walls, the family only drew closer, together, wrapped in wool and silence, guarding warmth like a flame in the dark. That night, as snow began to fall in a hush so quiet it seemed to muffle the very stars, the village of Dunworth faded into a sleepy silence. The snowflakes drifted like slow feathers from the heavens, blanketing rooftops, pathways, even the crooked wooden fences that leaned tiredly against the earth. The land transformed into a world of white whispers, where even the trees stood still, as if holding their breath. Inside the cottage, the heat from the hearth had mellowed into a low amber glow. It flickered gently, casting elongated shadows that danced lazily along the walls. The hare stew had filled their bellies, and the children now lay curled together on their cot, lulled into sleep by warmth and fullness, a rare and treasured combination. Wilfred sat cross-legged by the fire, sharpening his small knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filled the silence, steady and slow, a sound he had known since childhood. Ellen sat opposite him, carding a tuft of raw wool, her hands moving in a soft and practiced motion. They didn't speak. They rarely needed to. In the long winters, words were precious and used sparingly, like spices. She paused finally and looked at him. "Snow's come early," she said quietly. Wilfred gave a slow nod. Could mean a long winter. Neither voiced the worry that hovered between them. A long winter was dangerous. It meant more wood, more food, more luck. And luck was the one thing they couldn't cut, dry, or store in a sack. Still, they had seen worse. Ellen reached for a linen bundle tucked near the hearth. Inside, folded with care, were 3 beeswax candles, their wicks stiff and untouched. She didn't light them. No, not tonight. But she opened the bundle and inhaled the faint scent, closing her eyes as if that alone could summon spring. They had saved these candles since All Hallows, resisting the temptation to burn them during the darkening days of Advent. Beeswax was a rarity, not like tallow. It burned clean, with a light that seemed almost golden. These were meant for the worst night, whichever night that turned out to be, the one when all hope felt brittle. Tonight was not yet that night. When she tucked the bundle back into its hiding place, she did so with care, as though she were laying down a sleeping child. Outside, the wind shifted. It came low and steady through the trees, weaving through branches and over rooftops, down chimneys and into cracks in the wall. A cold wind with teeth. In places like Dunworth, winter was not a season but a presence, a thing that crept and watched, and the peasants knew it. They spoke of it sometimes in stories for children as the hollow cold, a pale, thin figure that wandered the moors looking for doors left ajar or fires allowed to die. That was why Ellen always banked the fire so carefully, why she hung dried herbs in the rafters, and why she taught her children to never leave shoes near the door. Old beliefs clung tightly in the countryside, not because of ignorance, but because of memory. Generations had survived by blending superstition with wisdom, and in that mingling there was safety. Ellen wrapped herself in her cloak and stepped outside just for a moment. She needed to check on the goat. The snow crunched beneath her wooden clogs. She moved like a shadow across the yard, past the snow-laden hedge, and ducked beneath the slanted roof of the lean-to where the goat slept. Its eyes gleamed faintly in the dark, and it gave a low, tired bleat. She touched its coarse flank gently, feeling the warmth there. Still alive, still strong. It was a good sign. From where she stood, she could see the outlines of other cottages softened by snow. A dim flicker of light in old Wren's window. The blacksmith's forge, cold and dormant. Beyond, the woods loomed like a wall of quiet, where the snow swallowed all paths and the trees stood like sentinels. No one ventured there at night. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath curl into the night, then turned and made her way back. Inside, Wilfred had laid another log on the fire. He glanced up as she entered and moved aside so she could warm her hands. "I dreamt of my mother last night," she said quietly, as if afraid the memory might blow away. Wilfred looked up. What did she say? "She was by the old mill," Ellen whispered, staring into the fire. "The one that burned. She had her apron full of snowberries, and she told me to be careful with the salt." Wilfred nodded, without asking for explanation. Dreams had their own language. In the village, dreams were watched and remembered. They weren't just the echoes of a mind, but sometimes warnings or memories borrowed from the dead. Ellen took it seriously. The salt would be rationed even more strictly now. As the hours slid slowly into deeper night, the room cooled again. The fire could only reach so far, and the shadows thickened at the corners. Wilfred set the knife and whetstone aside and reached for a thin strip of hide. He began braiding it into a loop, something for Thomas, a sling perhaps, or a strap. His fingers moved with a quiet competence, and the work helped him think. In the cot, Marjorie stirred and whimpered. Ellen moved to her side, gently brushing her hair back from her forehead. "She's warm," she said. "Too warm." Wilfred asked, his voice low. Ellen paused. "No," she said after a moment, "just enough." There were nights when children didn't wake up, nights when fever came with no warning, but not tonight. They added another blanket to the bed. One Ellen had woven herself over 2 summers, using scraps of dyed wool that the weaver had discarded. Each square was a different shade, muddy blue, faded green, soft ochre. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. The fire burned low again, its glow now just a pulsing breath in the dark. Wilfred moved to the cot, lay beside the children and opened his arms. Ellen followed. She curled against him, their bodies a fortress of warmth around their sleeping young. In the stillness, you could hear the slow, shared rhythm of their breath. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village like a soft shroud. But inside the little cottage, time seemed to pause. Wrapped in wool, in silence, and in one another, the family rested. And though the cold prowled just beyond the door, it would not cross the threshold tonight. The next morning came not with light, but with a gradual lifting of the dark. The snow-covered world outside had muffled every sound, so even the rooster's cry seemed distant, swallowed by the hush that lay over Dunworth like a thick quilt. It was one of those winter dawns, where even the sun seemed reluctant to rise, hiding behind a veil of grey cloud and fog, casting the village into a world of blurred edges. Inside the cottage, breath still lingered in the air in soft, misty puffs. Ellen awoke to the familiar stiffness in her joints, the kind that came from sleeping in the cold, no matter how many layers they wore. She stretched her fingers, rubbed her wrists, and quietly slid from the shared bed. The fire had gone low again. A few glowing coals pulsed faintly beneath the ash. She crouched, gathered a handful of kindling from the woven basket nearby, and slowly built the fire anew. It was an art as much as it was necessity, knowing just how to coax life from embers without smothering them. She did it by feel, by memory. The room began to glow again, faintly at first, then stronger, and with it came the first promise of warmth. Thomas stirred next, then Marjorie, and finally little Edda, blinking sleepily and rubbing her nose with the back of her mittened hand. They did not speak right away. Mornings in winter were often silent, as if words took time to thaw. Wilfred had not returned to sleep after his usual early waking. He had risen while the stars still clung to the sky and left quietly, boots crunching across the snow-packed earth, to check the snares and see whether the cold had gifted them another meal. The door had shut behind him with a groan and a sigh, and now the frost clung in delicate lace patterns around its edges. With the fire alive again, Ellen began preparing the day's first task, warming yesterday's bread and boiling a pot of water for steeped herbs. She reached for the small satchel hanging above the hearth, untying its thin leather strap. Inside were bundles of dried leaves, elderflower, yarrow, and mint. She chose carefully, selecting a pinch of each, then dropping them into the pot with reverence. The scent slowly began to rise with the steam, earthy and clean, blending with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering memory of last night's stew. It was not breakfast in the way we know it, but in this cottage it was ritual, warmth and medicine in a single breath. Marjorie, already wrapping herself in her cloak, fetched the chamber pot from behind the door and took it out to be emptied. Even at 9, she moved with a practiced awareness of the cold, of the ice beneath her feet, of the snow's deceptive softness. She walked carefully, her small boots leaving prints alongside the tracks Wilfred had made earlier. Ida followed, tugging along her old rag doll, its face faintly embroidered, its head misshapen from years of holding. She didn't go far, just stood in the doorway, nose nearly pressed to the wooden frame, watching the falling snow with a mixture of awe and suspicion. To a child, winter looked like a fairy tale, but she too had learned not to trust it completely. Thomas helped Ellen by stirring the herb water slowly. He had a careful hand, and she trusted him with fire. Already he was beginning to resemble his father, stoic, wide-shouldered and quiet. But his eyes still held that flicker of curiosity that the years had not yet dulled. By the time Wilfred returned, the morning was firmly set. His beard was dusted with frost, and he carried with him 2 small birds, thrushes, tangled in one of his snares. Their bodies were limp, feathers ruffled by their final flutters. He laid them on the table without a word, and Ellen gave a soft nod of thanks. No meat was wasted, no creature taken without acknowledgement. She said a quiet rhyme under her breath as she reached for her small blade, a rhyme her mother had taught her, who had learned it from hers, and so on, back through time. Feather to earth, bone to flame, you fed your young, now do the same. The birds would be skinned, the bones boiled for broth, the feathers saved for pillow stuffing or kindling. Even their tiny feet had uses in charms or for sewing kits. Waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. Wilfred removed his cloak, hung it on the peg beside the door, and sat near the hearth. His hands were red, cracked deeper today. Ellen brought him the herb water, and he drank it slowly, silently. Warmth spread through him with each sip, chasing the frost from his chest. He didn't speak of the cold, no one did. But it was always there, in the stiffness of their limbs, in the cautious way they moved, in the way every breath seemed just a little bit shorter in the mornings. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A dog barked distantly. A wooden cart creaked by, its wheels crunching over snow and frozen earth. The church bell rang once, just once, to mark the hour. It was not loud. It was not meant to be. But its sound carried through the village like a thread pulling everyone into the rhythm of the day. After the birds were plucked and set to boil, Ellen returned to her spinning. She sat by the fire with her drop spindle, feeding in tufts of wool pulled from a burlap sack by her side. The spindle turned slowly, steadily, twisting fibre into yarn. The sound it made was nearly silent, a soft whirring like breath through dry grass. It was meditative work, and necessary. Wool was gold, not for its rarity, but for its warmth. Every scrap mattered. Even the smallest length of yarn could be sewn into socks, mittens, patches for a torn cloak. Thomas took up a needle and tried his hand at patching an old leather pouch. Ellen guided him with her eyes more than her voice. The needle slipped a few times, pricking his thumb, but he did not cry out. Instead, he pressed the drop of blood against his tunic and kept going. Outside, Wilfred had begun sweeping the snow from the roof with a long wooden pole. Snow left too long on the thatch could soak through, rot the straw, and collapse part of the roof under its weight. This was maintenance, not chore. It was the slow, quiet art of keeping a home standing under the weight of a season designed to take everything away. By midday, the stew was done. Bird bones softened, meat loosened, broth thickened with barley and a few wild carrots that had been buried in the root cellar. The family gathered to eat, each spoonful precious. And then came the hush again, a winter afternoon's quiet, the kind that felt like time holding its breath. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not heavily but steadily, like it had no intention of stopping. Inside, the cottage pulsed with warmth, firelight, and the slow turning of the spindle. They did not speak of spring. Not yet. Spring was still a faraway dream, sleeping beneath the snow. For now they focused on the day, on the meal, on the spinning of wool and the mending of leather. The cold pressed close against the walls, but inside they endured. Together, quietly, without complaint. The pale afternoon light lingered just a little longer than the day before, though none in Dunworth marked it. In the depths of winter, such subtle changes were noticed only by the birds and trees, creatures with rhythms of their own. For the peasants, the season was not counted in hours or inches of snow, but in the dwindling sacks of grain, the tightness in their joints, and the number of nights they could still bank the fire without fear. As the sky dimmed again, drawing a quiet veil over the village, Ellen lit a twist of dry moss and tucked it into a small clay holder near the hearth. The moss burned low, its earthy scent mingling with the fading stew and the tang of melting snow tracked in on boots. It was not for light, nor for warmth. It was a small warding, another old practice whispered down from mother to daughter. Burning moss was said to keep illness from settling in the lungs, especially during the dark weeks of January, when the cold seemed to dig deepest. Outside, snowflakes fell thicker now, no longer gentle. They clung heavily to the eaves, to the rafters, piling like silent fingers pressing downward. Wilfred had checked the weight on the roof twice already. Each time he'd muttered a quiet curse, not from fear, but from the knowledge that too much snow would force him to climb up before dawn to scrape again, and every climb carried risk. Inside, the family huddled close. It was too cold to spread out. Even moving from one side of the room to another felt like stepping into a different season. Marjorie sat with her knees tucked to her chest, a piece of scrap linen across her lap. She was stitching a small pouch, her fingers clumsy but determined. Ellen watched her from across the room and said nothing. Children learned best in silence, where their hands could speak for them. Edda played on the floor with her rag doll, brushing its frayed woolen hair with a twig comb Wilfred had carved last spring. She sang under her breath, an old song with no clear words, just sounds carried from her mother's hums and murmurs. Her voice rose and fell with the wind outside. Thomas worked beside the fire, carefully twisting lengths of twine together. He was trying to make a small rope strong enough to tie a bundle of firewood or hang dried herbs from the rafters, his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. Ellen, watching all of them, felt a kind of quiet ache, a familiar one. Not sorrow, but the heaviness of knowing how much could change with one bad night. How thin the walls were between comfort and calamity. She tucked that feeling away deep beneath the wool layers at her chest and returned to her spinning. The day continued like that, in a rhythm so slow it almost stopped. No one spoke unless they needed to. Voices in winter were like firewood, not to be wasted. Just before evening truly settled in, there was a knock at the door. A knock in winter was rare. Visitors meant trouble, news, or barter. Sometimes all three. Wilfred looked up from sharpening a small blade. Ellen paused mid-spin. The children froze, instinctively quieting themselves. The knock came again, softer this time. A single deliberate rap. Wilfred stood and crossed the room, opening the door just enough to let in a breath of snow and a shape barely visible against the grey. It was Edith, the widow from the far side of the village. She was wrapped in a patched shawl, her nose red from the cold, a bundle clutched close to her chest. Her eyes were wet, not from tears, but from the wind. "Evening, Wilfred," she said quietly. "I beg pardon for the hour." "You're welcome," he replied, stepping aside without question. She entered like a breeze, hesitant and quick. Her bundle shifted, revealing a boy no older than 3, bundled so tightly that only his flushed cheeks and wide eyes were visible. "Fire's still warm," Ellen said, gesturing to the hearth. Edith knelt there without another word, holding the child near the heat, letting the cold melt from his skin in slow drips. Ellen brought a cup of hot water, which the boy accepted with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "What happened?" Wilfred asked softly. Edith shook her head. "Flue's blocked. Smoke filled the whole place. Can't sleep there tonight. Thought to come here just till morning." "No need to explain," Ellen said, already pulling extra cloth from the shelf. "You'll stay as long as you need." The child, now quieter, leaned against Edith's shoulder, his eyes beginning to droop. Ada approached, doll in hand, and offered it without speaking. The boy blinked, then nodded. The two sat together near the hearth, children of different homes, now linked by warmth. It was not uncommon, these visits. Winter did not care for pride. In the cold months, villagers sheltered where they could. One night in a warmer room might mean the difference between a lingering cough and something worse. Wilfred set about rearranging the sleeping space, pulling rush mats and rolled blankets into tighter arrangements. They would sleep shoulder to shoulder, pressed so close that breath would fog between them. But no one complained. There was no such thing as privacy in survival. That night, as the snow piled higher against the walls, the family grew by 2. Ellen lay awake longer than usual, listening to the breathing around her. She could tell who was who by the rhythm. Wilfred's deep and slow, Tomas's short and even, Marjorie's interrupted by faint whistles. The widow breathed in sighs, and the child murmured now and then, half dreaming. Above them, the wind whistled again, searching for cracks, but the shutters held. The moss smoked gently. The fire, banked deep in ash, continued to glow. And in the silence, with one more body near the fire and one more child tucked into wool, the cold seemed to pause, just for a little while. That morning, the air inside the cottage was thick with warmth and the smell of damp wool. The bodies, all curled together like roots of the same tree, began to stir slowly as the grey light crept in through the linen-covered windows. Breath still fogged in the air, but less than it had the morning before. 7 souls under one roof, breathing in rhythm, made a difference. The cold had been pressed just a little further away. Edith sat up first, her shawl falling slightly from her shoulder. Her son, Simon, was still asleep beside Ida, one hand clutching the leg of the rag doll. Edith's eyes moved across the room and paused when she found Ellen already awake, sitting by the hearth, stirring the morning pot with quiet focus. "Thank you," Edith whispered. Ellen didn't look up, but she nodded. "It's nothing," she said softly. "The warmth belongs to all of us, not just one." Outside, the snow had grown heavy. It leaned against the door like a visitor too weary to knock. The rooftops sagged under its weight, and fences had nearly disappeared into white mounds. In the distance, the church bell rang, one slow chime, not from the tower but by hand. A signal. It meant the roads were impassable. Wilfred heard it from where he was tying his boots. He grunted once and pulled his cloak tighter. "No way to town today," he muttered. Ellen already knew. She had seen the signs in the sky the day before. The kind of snow that didn't dance or flurry but fell straight, thick and certain, like it had been sent with purpose. The stew that morning was thin, stretched with the last of the barley and seasoned only with salt. Everyone took smaller portions without being asked. The children chewed slowly, savouring the warmth it gave, not the taste. After they ate, Wilfred stood by the door, peering through a slit in the shutter. "Should check on old Wren," he said. "He's nearer the woods than the rest." Ellen nodded. "And the Thatcher girl, her mother's not well." Edith stood as well. "I'll go with him. We can carry supplies." Wilfred hesitated. "You sure?" She straightened her shoulders. "I've walked worse." There was no debate. In the village, kindness was not debated. It was done. He handed her one of the cloaks from the peg. It was large on her, but warm. She wrapped Simon in a blanket and kissed his head before placing him in Ellen's arms. "Mind him?" "As my own," Ellen said. Wilfred and Edith left into the snow, the wind swallowing the sound of the door closing behind them. Inside, the day moved slowly. Ellen shifted Simon to her hip while stirring the coals with her free hand. Marjorie swept the corners of the room with a broom of bundled twigs. Edda helped Thomas count the remaining firewood stacks. Only 4 now. They would need to cut more soon, but the path to the woodlot was hidden, the trees silent and heavy with white. "Why don't we burn the chairs?" Edda asked quietly. Ellen looked up. "Because we'd have nothing to sit on when spring comes." "But spring's far," Ada said. Ellen smiled, though it was faint. "That's why we wait. Spring's not gone, just sleeping." Simon played quietly by the hearth, dragging the rag doll across the stones. He didn't speak much, but his eyes were wide and sharp, taking everything in. He watched how Ellen folded the blankets, how Thomas split kindling with the small hatchet, how Marjorie braided the ends of the rush mat to keep them from fraying. In a world ruled by silence, observation was how children learned. By mid-morning, the wind rose again. It howled through the cracks in the shutters like a lost animal, trying to get inside. Ellen moved quickly, tucking more wool into the window's edge, pressing her hands to the seam of the door. The cold was always knocking, and if you let it in too long, it would settle. To pass the time, she pulled a wooden box from beneath the bed. Inside were small treasures, not of gold or coin, but things kept for days like this. A cracked comb made of bone, 3 beads of blue glass, a scrap of fine red cloth from an old bishop's robe, and a small leather-bound book with pages so worn the ink had begun to fade. She opened the book gently, and the children gathered close. It was written in Latin, though few could read it. Ellen couldn't, but she remembered the stories her grandmother had told from it, reciting the words by heart long after the script meant nothing. She began softly. "There was once a stag in the forest who walked without fear." The children listened, eyes wide, even Simon, who clutched the rag doll in both hands now. Ellen's voice wove through the room like a thread of smoke, pulling them close, holding the cold at bay, not just with fire, but with story. In winter, stories were more than entertainment. They were memory. They were how the past was kept alive when the world outside seemed to forget everything green and living. They were also how warnings were given, quietly, without causing fear. She spoke of the stag who helped lost travellers find their way, of the old woman who carried fire in her pockets, of the boy who slept for 100 years and woke to find the world green again. These were not fairy tales in the way we know them. They were soft truths hidden in fables, told with reverence. The children did not ask questions. They listened the way you listen to the wind in the trees, knowing it speaks even if you don't yet understand. The hours passed. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the stories filled the space between heartbeats. When the fire burned low, Thomas fetched another log. When Simon grew restless, Marjorie took him to the window to show him where the trees were buried under snow. When Edda began to doze, Ellen wrapped her in a blanket and rocked her gently. Afternoon faded into dusk without anyone marking the time. It was only when the door opened with a hard gust of snow that they all turned. Wilfred and Edith stood there, cheeks red, cloaks crusted with frost, arms heavy with bundles, turnips, kindling, a wrapped cloth that smelled faintly of smoked fish. Gifts returned from neighbours who'd been warmed, fed, checked on. Ellen smiled for the first time that day. "You made it." "Barely," Wilfred said, stomping off the snow, "but we've got enough to stretch the week." Edith moved to Simon, lifting him into her arms. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, but he laid his head on her shoulder and breathed deeply, as though he knew she had brought something back with her from the storm. That night the stew was thicker, the room was warmer, the family was larger, if only by a single night, and while the wind still whispered at the windows, it found no space to enter. Only breath, laughter and story, curling through the room like threads of wool, weaving a home strong enough to outlast the snow. That night, sleep came easier. The storm outside had spent its fury, and by midnight the wind dropped to a whisper, its breath no longer sharp but weary, like a beast tired of prowling. Snow still fell, but softly now, descending in lazy spirals, no longer driven but drifting. Inside the cottage, the fire pulsed gently under the ash, faint orange light painting the walls with the shadows of those who slept. Bodies were tucked in close, limbs overlapping, like woven roots in a forest. The cottage, though humble, breathed with warmth, a living shelter, bound together by habit, effort and shared need. Wilfred stirred just before dawn. His dreams had been restless, full of crackling trees and faraway cries he couldn't place. His instincts had grown sharper with the seasons, like a blade honed by repetition. He knew something had changed, though he couldn't say what. Quietly, he slipped from the bed. The cold greeted him immediately. Its breath still seeped through the cracks in the doorframe, even when the wind was gone. He walked barefoot across the rushes to the door, pulling it open just wide enough to peer out. The world beyond was silver. Snow covered everything in thick, unbroken layers. The fence posts looked like blunt fingers reaching from a buried hand. The road to the church had vanished entirely, and even the trees stood stunned, their limbs bowed beneath the weight. Smoke curled from only one other chimney. Most fires had burned low during the storm. He stepped outside, careful with each placement of his feet. The snow came nearly to his knees, crusted over from the wind. He didn't go far, just enough to stretch his arms and take in the quiet. The silence was almost sacred. Not even birds called. Then he heard it. A distant cracking. Sharp, deliberate, not natural. He turned toward the woods. It came again. A single crack, like a branch breaking under strain, but deeper. Not dry. Something heavier. He squinted. In the half-light of early morning, it was difficult to see past the rise at the edge of the trees. But he didn't move toward it. Instead, he backed into the house, shutting the door with care. Ellen was awake by then, sitting up and pulling her shawl around her shoulders. She looked at him without asking. Her eyes always asked the question without words. "Sound in the woods," he said, "too clean, not an animal." She nodded once. That was enough. The village had an old understanding. When something unfamiliar broke the silence of a heavy snow, you didn't investigate alone. You waited, you gathered, you watched. Winter was not a season for curiosity, it was a season for caution. Ellen rose and started the fire anew. The children stirred slowly, the way creatures do when pulled from hibernation. Thomas sat up first, rubbing his eyes, then Marjorie. Ada rolled over and groaned softly, wrapping her arms around her own middle, too drowsy to rise. Breakfast was thin again, more hot water, a bit of turnip, a sliver of barley bread, but no one complained. The food warmed their bellies, and the smell of the fire softened the sharpness of hunger. Wilfred dressed slowly, layering himself with what little they had. A second tunic, patched and stiff with age, wool leggings bound with strips of leather. His boots, damp from the day before, were dry enough to wear again. He tied them tight. "I'll go to the green," he said. "See if anyone else heard it." Ellen gave him a thick cloth folded twice. "For your face," she said. He pressed a hand to her shoulder before opening the door again. The light had shifted slightly, greyer now, and the snow still fell in a slow drift. The village green was little more than a wide space between the cottages, normally marked by a small wooden cross and a patch of withered grass. Today it was barely visible. Only the tips of the cross poked above the snow, the rest buried in silence. 2 other villagers had gathered there already. Old Wren, bundled in a cloak so patched it looked like it had been stitched from a dozen different lifetimes, and Thatch, the cooper, broad-shouldered and red-faced from the cold. They greeted each other with nods, no need for words yet. "You heard it too?" Wilfred asked eventually. Wren nodded. "Before sunrise, something heavy broke like a limb, but not dry, too thick. Too close to the woods," Thatch added. "Sounded wrong." No one said what they were all thinking, that the woods in winter were not safe, that something inside the trees moved differently when the snow came. They weren't afraid, fear was a luxury, but they were wary, and wariness kept people alive. "We wait," Wilfred asked. Wren said. "Midday. If it happens again, we go, together." Wilfred returned home, snow now sticking to the edges of his cloak, his boots dragging faint lines through the surface of the snow. Inside, Ellen had begun boiling the fish they'd received the day before. The cottage smelled of salt and smoke and faint herbs. She handed him a cup as he entered. It was just hot water, but his fingers curled around it as if it were gold. "Other men heard it too," he said. She didn't reply, only nodded. Then she turned to the children. "Today we stay near the fire. No one goes outside." They obeyed without question. Even Edda, who usually begged to follow the chickens or gather twigs, sat quietly and braided lengths of wool with Marjorie. Thomas watched the window. The snow had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. It rarely did. Outside, the world was motionless, timeless. But the boy's eyes remained fixed on the woods beyond the slope, as if he were waiting for the trees to move. By midday, the three men gathered again. This time with spears, long, sharpened branches hardened by fire, not for fighting, just for caution. They walked side by side toward the woods, their footsteps making deep prints, a trail behind them like a winding scar through the white. At the cottage, Ellen paused her spinning. The quiet outside had grown too still. She stood slowly and crossed to the door, resting her hand on the frame. From the trees far away came a sound, soft, strange, not like wood or wind. A breath, a murmur. She leaned her head forward, listening. The children fell silent too, instinctively. And in that moment, the world felt like it was holding its breath again, not from snow or cold or wind, but something older, deeper, waiting beneath the trees. The sound came again, not loud, but distinct. A drawn-out creak, like leather stretched across timber, followed by a soft, dragging thud. Ellen held still, her hand tightening on the doorframe. It wasn't wind, it wasn't ice falling from branches. It was slower, heavier, deliberate. The children froze behind her. Even Simon, who had been quietly chewing on a piece of linen beside the hearth, stopped mid-motion, his wide eyes searching Ellen's face for a reaction. There was no fear in her expression, but there was something else. Alertness, sharpened over many winters. She turned from the door and crossed the room without speaking, reaching for a heavy wooden latch near the back wall. It was rarely used, only in storms or when the wind howled fierce enough to lift the door from its hinges. She dropped the bar across the entrance with a dull thump. The room dimmed as the last grey light from outside vanished behind thick wood. Marjorie looked up, her lips parting to speak, but Ellen held up her hand. "Not now," she whispered. She moved then to the hearth, stirred the coals, and added another log. The fire crackled, the sound like tiny bones snapping in the silence. She did not explain. Children in Dunworth didn't need explanations in winter. They understood from tone, from gesture, from the shift in the wind. Outside, the sound had stopped, but that was worse somehow. Inside the woods, the silence felt different than it had in the village. Wilfred walked slowly, spear in hand, his eyes scanning the trees. Wren walked to his left, one eye half-lidded from an old wound, but his hearing sharper than most. Thatch brought up the rear, footsteps heavy but steady. They didn't speak. In the snow-covered woods, even breathing felt too loud. The deeper they went, the more distorted the trees became, twisted not by magic but by years of wind and snow and creeping ivy. Branches bowed with frost, some cracked and splintered. Snow muffled their footsteps, but still, every now and then, a crow would burst from a branch above and vanish like smoke into the grey sky. And then they saw it. At the base of an old elm, one of the oldest trees in the woods, lay something that did not belong. The snow around it was churned, packed down in strange spirals and slashes. Blood, just beginning to freeze, had seeped in thin rivulets down the trunk. And on the ground, half buried in the snow, was a carcass. A stag, young, broad-chested. Its antlers snapped in two as if from a great force. But it wasn't the death that drew their silence, it was the way it had been left. No predator in the forest left meat untouched, and yet the body was whole. No bite marks, no torn flesh, just a great wound in the side, clean, deliberate, as if struck by a blade or something heavier. Thatch stepped forward first and knelt beside the animal. He pressed a hand to its shoulder, still warm beneath the fur. "Dead not long," he whispered. Wren knelt too, his good eye narrowing. "Look there." Just beyond the body, etched faintly into the snow, was a mark. At first Wilfred thought it was a footprint, but it wasn't shaped right. It was long, dragging, as if something had knelt there, or leaned. The mark ended in a trail leading deeper into the trees. "Fox?" Thatch asked. "No fox does this," Wren said. Wilfred nodded toward the trail. "We follow?" There was a pause. Then Wren shook his head. "No, not today." And no one argued. They covered the stag with branches and snow, a quiet gesture of respect. To leave it exposed would invite scavengers, or worse. The forest had a way of remembering the disrespectful. By the time they returned to the village, the light had begun to dim again, though it was still early. Snow had settled onto their shoulders and their cloaks hung heavy with moisture. Ellen opened the door before Wilfred knocked. She always sensed his return. He stepped inside, removing his cloak, and hung it silently. The children looked at him, waiting, but he offered no tale, only a glance toward Ellen and a single word, "Stag." She understood. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not from relief, but from knowledge. The unknown had a name now, though its cause remained cloaked. That night, supper was quiet. The broth was thin, but warm. Simon nestled between Ida and Marjorie, who whispered little stories to him. Nothing grand, just the tales of the fire, and how sometimes it snapped to let you know it was listening. Wilfred sat by the hearth long after the others had gone to bed. The flames lit the edges of his face, throwing shadows beneath his eyes. He held his spear in one hand, running his fingers along its shaft over every nick and scrape. Tools were often old friends, and tonight he needed company. Ellen joined him after a time, her wool cloak wrapped around her shoulders. She sat without a word, hands folded, eyes on the fire. "They say it's a bad omen," she murmured finally. Wilfred didn't ask who they were. In a village like Dunworth, they were the echoes of grandmothers, long gone but never truly silent. He nodded once. "Maybe. Do we prepare?" He glanced over his shoulder to where the children lay, curled together in a knot of limbs and blankets. Simon's little hand was resting on Ada's arm. "We already are." The fire crackled again. Outside, the woods stood still. The wind had not returned. But somewhere beneath the trees, in a place where the snow did not melt even in spring, the silence was listening, and it had begun to shift. The following morning brought no sun. The sky remained a pale, depthless grey, as if the heavens themselves had turned to stone. The snow had stopped falling, but its presence lingered heavily, coating every surface, pressing down on every rooftop, thick along the lanes that wound between the cottages of Dunworth. A silence clung to the village like a second skin, not the peaceful hush of snowfall, but something tighter, more alert. Inside the cottage, breath still fogged the air. Ellen woke with her eyes already open, her body resting, but her mind taut like a drawn thread. She hadn't slept deeply. Few did, after a night like that. There had been no new noises from the woods, but the absence itself felt loud, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. She rose slowly, careful not to disturb the others. Wilfred was already awake, though he remained lying on his back, eyes fixed on the rafters above, where little frost crystals had formed around the edges of the beams. His hands rested on his chest, clasped like a man mid-prayer. But he wasn't praying. He was remembering. The stag, the mark in the snow, the trail that vanished deeper into the wood. He could still smell the iron scent of blood in the cold. He sat up when Ellen moved to the hearth, her feet wrapped in cloth to muffle each step. The fire had survived the night once again. A breath of warmth greeted her fingers as she stirred the embers, adding slivers of kindling like a mother feeding a waking child. There was little food to stretch that morning. They shared a barley cake, hard and flat from the previous day, soaked briefly in hot water to soften it. The last of the dried greens went into the pot, bitter but filling, and a pinch of salt was added with reverence. They each ate in silence, chewing slowly, eyes lowered. Even the children spoke little. Outside, the snow groaned beneath its own weight. Somewhere in the village, a roof sagged audibly, wood creaking, straw collapsing inward. Ellen winced at the sound but didn't move. There were too many cottages, too few hands. Mid-morning came without brightness, and Wilfred stood, pulling on his boots. He wrapped a length of wool around his neck and reached for the spear, the one he'd sharpened the night before. "I'll check the traps," he said, not for conversation, but for clarity. Ellen simply nodded. As he stepped out into the cold, his shape briefly filled the doorway before vanishing into white. He took the long path toward the grove this time, passing old Wren's hut, still smoking, still intact, and skirted around the edge of the field, where snow sat like a shroud over last summer's rye. Beneath it, the earth was hard, unwelcoming. The traps lay in a small hollow where rabbits often passed through in warmer months. Wilfred had set 3 snares 2 days earlier, and he wasn't expecting much. Hunger made even the careful clumsy, and he'd laid them fast, fingers already stiff with cold. He checked the first, empty. The second, a broken loop, snapped in the middle, disturbed. The third held something. He crouched low. A hare. Its fur was thick-bellied and body limp, still warm. He reached for it, then paused. Something was wrong. The snow around the trap was disturbed, not just by the hare's final struggle, but by something else, something that had knelt there or crouched. A smear of dirt, a faint drag. He touched it with gloved fingers. The snow had been brushed deliberately, like someone, or something, had tried to cover tracks. But too late. He could see where the snow had been kicked aside, not just trampled, pushed. He looked up quickly, heart suddenly thudding. The trees swayed faintly in the distance, branches heavy with frost. Nothing moved, no birds, no foxes, not even the wind. The hare's eyes were wide open. Its throat was marked, not from the trap, but from a single shallow cut, like a blade had grazed it. Wilfred stood slowly, the hare still dangling from one hand, and scanned the woods. He was being watched. He couldn't see from where, but the feeling clung to his skin like frostbite. He backed away from the hollow, never turning his back to the trees, and began the slow walk home, every step measured, as if he were walking over ice that might crack beneath him. Back at the cottage, Ellen had begun boiling water again, crushing dried juniper berries into a cloth with a flat stone. They were meant for fever, but she wasn't making them for illness. She was making them for protection. Thomas helped her tie the small sachets, binding them with strands of wool. Each bundle would be hung in the corners of the room, above the door, beside the hearth. Not to keep the cold out, but something else. Simon watched quietly from beside the fire. His fingers played with a length of twine, forming loops. He wasn't smiling. Children sensed things differently. The air around them had changed, and though he didn't speak, his silence said more than words. When Wilfred returned, snow clung to his beard and shoulders. He laid the hare on the table and did not meet Ellen's gaze. She saw the stiffness in his posture, the tightness around his mouth, but she didn't ask. Instead, she took the animal and began cleaning it with care. Later that day, a knock came at the door. This time it was Wren. He stood without his dog, a rare thing. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, but his eyes were clear. "You saw it too," he said before Wilfred could speak. Wilfred nodded. "Trap was disturbed. Hare was cut." Wren exhaled through his nose. "Same with mine. Fox not touched it. Deer tracks too, but wrong shape, dragged." They both stood in the doorway, snow drifting past them like breath. "Something's moving," Wren said, "and it's not just looking for food." Wilfred didn't answer. Ellen stepped behind him, pressing a dried bundle into his palm, sage and juniper wrapped in wool. "Hang it outside," she said. Wren nodded, took it, left. As night returned, darker than before, they ate the hare slowly. Ellen served it with boiled roots and a broth that warmed the bones. The children ate without noise. Even Edda chewed solemnly, eyes on the fire. After the meal, Ellen walked the room, hanging each of the herb bundles with care. She whispered no spells, but the silence with which she worked was spell enough. When the fire was banked and the shutters drawn tight, she joined Wilfred by the hearth once more. They didn't speak. The light flickered on their faces. Outside, the snow had started again, light, soft, patient. Somewhere deep within the forest, the silence stretched. Something had left the cover of trees, and it had begun to learn their paths. The 10th night of deep winter pressed its weight upon Dunworth like a second sky. It came not with thunder or wind, but with a slow, steady descent of snow so fine it resembled ash. Each flake seemed to fall with purpose, as though laying out a shroud across the land, white, quiet, and complete. Within the cottage, the hush settled over everything. Even the fire burned quieter, its usual crackles muffled as if it too sensed the need for restraint. Ellen sat near the hearth with her spindle once again, though her hands moved slower than before. The wool twisted in her fingers, smooth and rhythmic, but her gaze was distant, fixed more on the shadows flickering along the walls than on the thread she spun. Behind her, Marjorie and Thomas lay bundled on the cot, facing each other, whispering beneath their breath. They weren't telling stories this time. They were trying to recall a rhyme their grandmother had once taught them, a warding song sung during long winters. Ada had fallen asleep, curled at Simon's side, her arm wrapped around his chest. The little boy barely moved, but his breath came steadily, slow and even. He had grown quiet these last days, as if the silence outside had taken root inside him. Wilfred was at the door again. Not outside, not yet, but watching it. He had dragged the small bench from the far wall and set it directly beside the threshold. There he sat, spear leaning upright beside him, one hand resting on its shaft, the other wrapped around a cup of weak broth gone cold. His ears strained with each gust, each creak of the shutters. The forest was too quiet. Earlier that day he had walked the edge of the village with Thatch and Wren. They had found more signs, strange prints in the snow. Not the clear, crisp hoof marks of deer or the sharp toes of foxes, but something dragging as if a body moved without purpose or shape. One mark even passed beneath the arching bough of the old ash tree near the well, where children used to tie ribbons in spring. Nothing passed that way now. No birds, no squirrels, no rabbits. The woods were empty of sound. Wilfred hadn't told Ellen everything. He had found something else, something small. A bundle of feathers, sparrow, by the look of them, lashed together with a strand of blackened twine, hung from a branch just above one of the disturbed snares. It had not been made by any creature of the forest. He had buried it under snow and marked the spot with a notch in the nearest tree. He didn't know why. Habit, maybe, or something deeper. Now, as he sat beside the door, his mind returned to it again and again. Who would have made such a thing, and why? Ellen set down her spindle with care. She moved to the table where she pulled a small cloth bundle from the shelf and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a flat piece of river slate, smooth and dark, and on it, etched by careful hands, were 4 worn symbols. They had no name, no explanation, just lines, curves, circles. Passed down from her mother's mother, who had once told her, "These are not to be drawn unless the cold feels too still and the birds stop calling." The birds had stopped 2 days ago. She took the slate to the hearth and placed it carefully among the stones, just beside the ash where the flame licked through the gaps. She did not speak, nor explain, but Wilfred saw, and he did not object. Outside, snow thickened again. The wind didn't howl. It slithered, low and slow, curling between the trees. It was not loud, but it was present, like breath at your neck. A sudden sound made Ellen's hand pause mid-motion and knock. Not on their door. Distant. Hollow. 3 short raps, then silence. Wilfred stood, body tense, spear in hand. Another knock. Closer this time. Still not theirs. Another house. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pressed his ear to the shutter. Ellen moved to the children, placing herself between them and the door. Knock, knock, knock. Then nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no retreat. Wilfred turned to her, voice low. "They're testing." "Who?" Marjorie asked, barely above a whisper. Neither parent answered. They remained that way for several minutes, waiting, breath shallow, hearts counting time. Then came another sound. This time not a knock, but a scrape. A long, deliberate scrape across wood. Outside the cottage. Wilfred raised the latch quietly, just enough to peek. Cold air slipped in, brushing across his face like a whisper. Nothing moved. He stepped out. Just a pace. Snow swallowed the sound of his boots. The night was still. And then we saw them. Footprints. Not fresh, not sharp, but new enough to have form. Human-shaped, barefoot. The stride was strange, too long for the size of the foot, as if whoever left them had moved awkwardly. Unnatural. They circled the house, one complete loop. He followed the prints with his eyes until they vanished at the far side of the cottage, just past the lean-to where the goat still slept beneath bundled straw. No other tracks returned. Whoever or whatever it was had not walked away. Wilfred stepped back inside and shut the door. He set the latch. Then he slid the iron poker from the hearth and laid it across the door handles. A small thing. A gesture, maybe. But it helped. Ellen met his gaze. No words passed between them. They sat near the fire for the rest of the night. The children slept, huddled close. The spear rested upright, its point casting a shadow that flickered and shifted with every breath of flame. And somewhere outside, the snow kept falling. And something else waited. Not at the edge of the forest anymore, but within the circle of firelight and stone. Watching. Listening. Learning the shape of their silence. Morning broke without ceremony. No sunrise, no sudden change of light, just a soft thinning of the darkness as though the night had been worn threadbare in places. The snow still fell, lighter now but steady, like a breath the sky hadn't finished exhaling. Inside the cottage, warmth clung to the low ceiling in a stubborn haze of smoke and breath. The fire had not gone out. The coals pulsed under the ash like dim eyes blinking slowly. Ellen stirred it gently, adding a sliver of bark and 2 small twigs, coaxing the heat back into flame. Wilfred had not slept. He sat in the same place he had the night before, on the bench near the door, spear resting across his lap. His eyes were hollow, not with fear, but with calculation. He had heard no more knocks, no more footsteps, but he hadn't needed to. The prints had been real. The scrape along the wall had not been imagined. Outside, someone, or something, had studied the shape of their dwelling. Ellen turned from the hearth and set a pot to boil, filled with snow packed into a wooden pail. There was no more water from the well. It had frozen over, the rope stiff with ice. They would need to send someone to break it soon, but not today. Not after what they had heard. Thomas woke next. His hair stuck out in a wild thatch, and he rubbed his face hard, blinking toward the door. "Did it come again?" he asked softly. Wilfred shook his head. "No, but it never left." Thomas nodded as though that made sense. Marjorie rose more slowly, helping Edda sit up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Simon remained curled under his cloak, watching them with wide, unblinking eyes. He hadn't said a word since the night before. Ellen handed out the morning portions, thin broth, mostly snowmelt with a few dried herbs and the last of the fish oil for fat. It warmed the stomach, though it barely touched the edge of hunger. As they ate, the knock returned, but this time it was real, human, clear, 3 short raps. Then a voice. "Wilfred?" "It's Wren." Wilfred was already at the door. He lifted the latch cautiously, leaving the iron poker across one arm. When he opened it, Wren stood just beyond the threshold, shoulders dusted with snow, his dog beside him. The animal's hackles were raised, eyes fixed on the woods. "We found something," Wren said, voice low. "Near the Thatcher girl's place." Wilfred stepped outside, Ellen behind him. Thatch had already gathered 2 others, Bram, the old miller's son, and Edric, the swineherd. They stood near the frozen well, where the prints from last night had curved east toward the edge of the village. Wren led them past the Thatcher cottage, which was shuttered tight, smoke curling from a poorly patched chimney. No one there had stepped outside. Beyond that, they reached a patch of snow pressed flat. It looked at first like a fallen tree branch had swept the ground, but closer inspection revealed the truth. A shape, a body-sized hollow in the snow. No footsteps near it, no drag marks leading in or out, just the impression of something that had lain there. Watching. Beside it, pressed into the crust of snow, was a single line, long, shallow, curved like a crescent. No one spoke of it, but they all knew the look of blade marks. Wilfred knelt and placed his hand against the indentation. It was cold, no warmth lingered, but the snow hadn't filled it in yet. "It waited here," Wren said, "all night." "For what?" Bram asked. Wilfred stood slowly, for the door to open. No one argued. They swept snow over the mark, roughing the shape until it no longer resembled anything, not out of fear, but to keep it from being remembered by the ground itself. When Wilfred returned, Ellen had already begun preparing a barrier. She had crushed the last of the rosemary and mixed it with ash from the hearth, forming a paste she daubed above the door, along the windows and across the latch. Not superstition, practice. These gestures were old, older than scripture, carried from one fire-warmed home to another, whispered between generations of women who had lived through winters deeper than this. Thomas helped silently, his fingers smudged with ash. Marjorie held a small bowl of herbs, while Edda tied knots in wool string, each one meant to hang like a bell pull, twitching at the slightest draught. They worked as one body, no questions, no instructions, only necessity. By midday, Wilfred began reinforcing the shutters. The wood was thin, and though it had held so far, the frost had started to warp it. He took the last of the spare timbers from the lean-to and hammered them in place with slow, careful strikes. Each hit of the mallet echoed through the snow like a bell. Ellen came to him, placing a cloth-wrapped bundle into his hand. Inside were 3 iron nails, blackened with soot, taken from the ruins of the old mill years ago. They weren't needed for the shutter. They were meant for something else. He nodded, and together they walked to the rear of the cottage. There, where the snowdrift was thickest, they found the spot where the scrape had ended the night before. A faint dent in the snow still lingered, shaped like a palm. It had reached the wall. Wilfred drove the first nail into the wood with a single strike, the second above it, the third to the right, forming a rough triangle. Not a symbol anyone in the village would name aloud, but one remembered nonetheless. Ellen pressed her palm against it for a moment, eyes closed. Then they returned inside. That night they did not bank the fire. They fed it. More wood than usual, more smoke curling into the room, but they didn't care. The heat was worth it. The light was worth it. Darkness outside meant nothing. It was the darkness that moved inside the snow that mattered. As they sat by the fire, Wilfred took Tomas's hand and showed him how to sharpen the spearhead again. Slow, deliberate strokes with the whetstone. "Why do I need to know this?" Tomas asked quietly. Wilfred didn't look up. "Because I might not always be here when something knocks." The boy said nothing after that. Ellen sang quietly to Edda as she combed her hair with a twig brush. Not a lullaby, but a weaving song, an old one with no words, just melody. It filled the cottage like thread looping through a loom, tying heartbeats to silence, firelight to the cold. They didn't sleep much, and when they did, it was in shifts. Wilfred sat by the door again. The iron poker stayed across the handles, and all around the cottage, buried deep beneath the white, the forest waited, watching, listening for the sound of an opening latch. The 12th night arrived like breath held too long, tight, quiet, full of weight. Snow no longer fell from the sky but hung there, suspended in the thick air like dust in a forgotten attic. The cold, once a creeping presence, had now settled in fully, no longer moving, no longer biting, just there. Immovable, watchful. Inside the cottage, the fire burned high and hot. It was the only sound now, crackling, popping. The scent of burning pine filled the air, mingled with rosemary and wool. No one spoke. Even the children, once lively in whispers, had grown solemn. Days of stillness had worn them into silence. Ellen sat close to the hearth, her knees pulled to her chest beneath her cloak. She had not spun in 2 days. The spindle lay unused by the wall, its thread frayed and knotted where her hands had left it. Her thoughts were not on wool or food, or even the fire. She was listening. Beyond the shutters, the snow made no sound. But in the pauses between the fire's sighs, there was something else. Something she could not name, like the breath of a sleeping animal, buried beneath the surface of the world. Wilfred had not left the house that day, not even to check the traps. It had been agreed in a silent glance exchanged over the fire that morning. The world outside no longer invited investigation. Instead, he had set about reinforcing what was already reinforced. He wedged lengths of wood beneath the door, sealing it tight, draped wet cloths over the seams of the windows to block any draught, checked each nail in the triangle at the back wall. Then, with steady hands, he had carved a mark into the inside of the door, a circle flanked by 2 small dots. It meant nothing to most, but it was older than the cross. His mother had carved it once, during a winter when the river froze from bank to bank and wolves howled within sight of the church tower. She had not explained it, but she'd carved it deep, and her cottage had stood untouched. Tomas sat near the hearth, sharpening a second stick with a piece of flint. The point wasn't very even, but Wilfred didn't correct him. The boy worked slowly, focused. Every now and then he would glance at the door, then return to his task. Marjorie was folding wool into bundles, scraps of old tunics, bits of worn cloaks, even pieces of old stockings. She tied them with string and stacked them near the hearth, ready to burn if the fire ran low. Waste was no longer a concern. Warmth was. Edda sat quietly with Simon, showing him how to draw circles in the ash on the hearthstone. She whispered as she worked, not in words but in humming sounds, like lullabies pulled from memory. Simon didn't hum back. But he watched every motion, eyes tracing each loop of her finger in the ash as if they were maps. The day passed slowly. Time folded in on itself. No visitors came, no calls across the village green, no bells from the chapel, no sound of carts or dogs. Even the birds, long gone, left no trace. Dunworth had become a place of waiting. When dusk came, it did so without colour. The world outside the windows simply grew denser, darker. The light inside the cottage became deeper gold, then red, then dim. Ellen added another log. And then the knock came again, not like the night before. This one was softer, not on the door, on the wall, the back wall. They froze. Even the fire seemed to still itself. The knock repeated, slow, rhythmic. 4 taps, evenly spaced. Too precise for wind, too polite for animal, too calm for human. Wilfred rose. He didn't move quickly. He set the spear aside first, not out of carelessness, but in silent acknowledgement. A spear wouldn't be useful now. He walked to the back wall and placed a hand against the wooden boards. The knocking stopped. Then something pressed back. Not hard, not loud, just pressure. Like a hand against the opposite side, mirroring his own. He withdrew. Ellen stood now too, clutching the bone-handled knife she kept near the herbs. She moved to the children, who watched without blinking. Then came the whisper. So faint, they nearly missed it. It came not from outside, but through the wood itself, like a breath through a hollow pipe. Cold's not the enemy, it said. It's the test. No one spoke. No one moved. The fire crackled again, loudly this time, as if asserting itself. Then silence. The pressure against the wall vanished. The boards no longer creaked. Wilfred placed a cloth over the mark on the wall, tacked it there with a long iron nail. Not to seal it, to forget it. The night deepened. They did not eat. Hunger no longer growled. It crouched instead, curled in the belly like a coiled rope. Ellen stirred a pot of snow to boil again. Not for tea, not for soup. Just to fill the air with steam, to keep the damp in their lungs, to keep the frost from settling. Simon slept sitting up, arms around his knees. Ida leaned against him, thumb tucked into her collar. Marjorie had begun whispering again, the rhyme now almost remembered. 12 nights of frost, 12 knocks at wood. Hide the iron, burn the blood. If shadow falls and speaks your name, let silence answer just the same. No one asked where she had learned it. Thomas repeated the lines under his breath like a charm. Wilfred returned to the bench by the door. He said nothing. Ellen sat by the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap. She did not pray. The night watched through the shutter's cracks, waiting, but no one opened the door. The 13th day of winter came without warning. Not in the way one might expect, with wind or with sudden snow, but with absence. The absence of sound, of movement, of change. Time in the village seemed to hold its breath. No snow fell from the sky, no clouds passed above. The air was a still sheet of glass, brittle and unmoving. Wilfred rose before the light again, though light itself had become a vague notion. He opened the shutter just enough to peer outside, and what he saw was not so much a landscape as it was an impression. Shapes blurred by frost, the outlines of cottages softened by powdery snow, the trees frozen like sketches waiting for ink. No footprints marred the whiteness, no trails. The snow was untouched. But he knew better. Ellen had not slept either. She sat with her back to the wall now, her head tilted toward the ceiling, eyes half-lidded as though listening to something far away. Her fingers rested in her lap, curled around a bundle of dried rowan twigs tied with a red thread. It was the last of them. She had burned the others the night before when the whispers came. She could still hear them, faint and distant, like echoes carried down through stone wells. The children were quieter than ever. Marjorie had begun wrapping bits of cloth around Ada's hands and feet, layer upon layer, not for play but for protection. She sang under her breath, always the same tune now, the same half-remembered rhyme. Thomas had grown watchful, keeping a sharpened stick beside him at all times. He no longer flinched at night noises. He simply stared toward the door. And Simon had begun to hum. It was a strange little melody, unfamiliar and tuneless. But it never stopped. He hummed while eating, while sleeping, even in his dreams. It wasn't loud, nor disturbing, but it set Ellen's teeth on edge. Not because of the sound itself, but because it felt like he was answering something. or someone. Around midday, Wilfred ventured outside again. He didn't go far, just to the shed behind the cottage where they kept a half-barrel of kindling beneath a waxed cloth. The wind didn't move as he walked, and each footstep pressed into the snow with a soundless puff. Even the crunch was gone, as if the world had forgotten how to echo. He reached the shed and paused. Something had been here. The cloth covering the barrel had been lifted, not torn or blown aside, but carefully peeled back, as if by someone who didn't want to wake a sleeping house. The snow around it bore no footprints. But Wilfred had been watching snow his whole life, and here in this untouched stillness he saw shadows, not of shape, but of intention. Slight hollows, as though something weightless had stood there long enough to press the memory of its form into the white. He did not touch the kindling. He turned and returned to the house, slower than before, each step deliberate, retracing the marks he'd made on the way out, trying not to leave new ones. When he entered, Ellen looked up and simply said, "We need to stay inside now." He nodded. They did not speak again for the rest of the afternoon. As twilight came, not truly darkness, but a dimming of what little light remained, Ellen began preparing something from the old black clay jar hidden beneath the hearthstones. She had not opened it in years, not since Marjorie was a baby, swaddled in smoke and fever. Inside were dried petals from a graveyard rose, crumbled teeth of foxes, ashes from a church candle long melted, and 3 small bones tied in linen. It was not food. It was not medicine. She mixed them in a bowl with melted snow and crushed charcoal from the bottom of the hearth. The paste turned a sickly grey, smelling faintly of iron and something bitter. With a thin stick, she painted 3 marks above the windows. One on the door, one beneath the hearthstone. Wilfred watched, saying nothing. He knew better. When she finished, she let the bowl burn in the fire until the contents hardened into a black puck. She did not break it. She did not move it. Just let it sit there, glowing faintly. The children were fed a weak soup made from nothing more than roots and herbs soaked in water, but no one complained. Simon hummed, and then he stopped. It was the first silence he had given them in 2 days. He looked up from the blanket where he sat beside Ada and whispered, "It's close." Ellen turned sharply. "What did you say?" Simon pointed toward the floorboards near the hearth. "It's under the house now." No one moved. Even the fire seemed to draw back, its flame lowering, dimming. Wilfred rose slowly and reached for the spear. Ellen took the children and moved them toward the back of the room, near the cold hearth wall, opposite the triangle of iron nails. Simon stood on his own, walked to the middle of the room. His humming returned, but softer now, slower. He tilted his head. "There's something looking up," he said. Thomas stepped forward, face pale, holding his stick tight. "Simon, come back." Simon didn't answer. Then, beneath their feet, a creak. A long, slow groan of old timber flexing. The fire flared again, sudden and loud. A draught swept through the room, lifting ash from the hearth, scattering it across the floor in a whirlwind. Ellen pulled Edda close. Marjorie reached for Thomas's arm. Wilfred dropped to a crouch near the floor, spear lowered. Then stillness. Simon sat down calmly. "It passed," he said. "It didn't find the opening." Ellen exhaled, not in relief. In preparation, because she knew. It would return tomorrow. It had learned something tonight, something about their walls, about their silence. And now it would wait for the next time someone forgot to cover the fire, or left a cloth untied, or said a name out loud. Night returned, heavier than before, and beneath the cottage the floor remained warm long into the dark, as though something had rested there. Listening. The 14th day began as all the others now seemed to, with a sky the colour of old bone, silent and unmoving. But the cold had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer a biting thing. It was weight now, dense and thick like invisible wool pressed against the lungs, the kind of cold that sank deeper than the skin, the kind that stayed, even near the fire. The children didn't wake all at once anymore. They emerged from sleep slowly, each with that same distant look, eyes unfocused for the first few minutes, as if they had returned from somewhere far away. Somewhere not quite sleep. Simon was already awake. He always was. He sat cross-legged by the hearth, watching the coals. He no longer hummed. But every now and then, he would tilt his head slightly, as if still listening for a note just beyond hearing. Ellen moved quietly through the room, checking the shutters again. even though she knew they had not been touched. She pressed her hand to each one, not just feeling for cold, but for breath, for presence. Sometimes she imagined she could tell the difference. Wilfred had barely slept. He sat sharpening the edge of the spear with a piece of shale, not because it was dull, but because movement kept the thoughts from growing teeth. His hands moved with precision, his gaze fixed on the blade. But he wasn't really watching it. He was watching memory, seeing again the hollow in the snow, the feather bundle, the voice pressed through the boards like a wet whisper. Marjorie had begun keeping a little pouch of salt tied around her wrist, not for flavour, but for the old belief. A pinch tossed at the threshold would turn away unwanted visitors. So she carried it everywhere now, though there was hardly enough to waste. Thomas had grown quiet, his thoughts sharper than his words. He stood often near the walls, listening, sometimes even pressing his ear to the boards. Ellen warned him not to, but he did it anyway. The food had nearly run out. One small loaf of rye remained, too dry to chew without soaking, a handful of yellowed peas, 2 onions, their skins papery and soft with age. They would make broth. Again, always broth. Ellen took the smaller onion and began peeling it. As she worked, she whispered quietly under her breath, not a song, not a prayer, just names. The names of the living, one by one. Wilfred, Marjorie, Thomas, Simon. She spoke them not to remind herself, but to keep them from slipping, as though speaking the names aloud might keep the silence from stealing them, might keep whatever listened at night from learning them first. Outside, the snow had settled unevenly. Small mounds dotted the path leading toward the church, mounds that had not been there the day before. No footprints led to them. No footprints led away, as if the snow had grown in places, lifting up in humps where the cold had grown curious. Wilfred saw them through the slit in the shutter and said nothing. Instead, he picked up the second spear, the shorter one, made from an old broom handle with a fire-hardened point. He placed it near the door, close enough to reach quickly. Ellen finished slicing the onion and added it to the pot. No one spoke of leaving the cottage anymore. The thought had become as distant as summer. They no longer dreamed of green fields or of warm soil underfoot, or even of rain. The only thing that moved beyond their walls now was snow, and something inside the snow that never made tracks. By midday, a sound came from above, not the roof creaking, though it did from time to time. This was different. A tap, a single slow tap above the children's sleeping corner. Then another, then silence. Wilfred moved toward it, but Ellen stopped him with a glance. Instead, she took a bowl of ash and climbed the ladder to the loft. No one followed. Up there, it was colder, the air tighter. Ellen crouched low and pressed her hand to the low beam beneath the thatch. It was warm, not fire warm, not sun warm, but body warm, as if something had passed across it not long before. She reached into the ash bowl and dipped her fingers, smearing 3 streaks across the beam, one for each knock. She whispered again, but this time she did not speak names. She spoke the old words, fractured bits of rhyme from the village's oldest woman who had died when Ellen was a girl, muttering spells into the blanket. When she descended again, the children looked at her, searching for answers. She had none. She only said, "Don't sleep near the loft wall tonight." That evening they moved their sleeping places, pushed the cot closer to the hearth, laid the blankets in a tight circle, back to back, like deer bedding down in a clearing. They did not light the candles. They kept only the fire. And when darkness came, it came fast. The sky outside did not fade gradually. It fell like a curtain dropped without warning. One moment it was day, the next, void. The fire cracked. A wind passed through the chimney, sharp and sudden, despite there being no wind outside. It shrieked down through the flue, sending a burst of soot into the room. The children gasped. Simon whispered, "It's learning the sounds of the house." Wilfred stood, spear in hand. He moved to the door, not to open it, but to listen. The iron poker trembled slightly where it rested across the latch. Ellen moved to the children, gathering them close. Then the faintest whisper pressed through the cracks of the door, "Let me remember your warmth." It was a voice like steam on stone, soft, patient, male, female, neither. A voice that had waited. Wilfred didn't speak, but he reached forward and pressed his palm flat against the wood. On the other side, a hand pressed back. The wood flexed slightly. Warmth passed through. He did not recoil. He pressed harder. Then, without warning, the warmth vanished, and the hand was gone. The wind stopped. The chimney fell silent. The fire calmed. He stepped back. Ellen met his eyes. "It's not trying to kill us," she said. "No," he answered. "It's trying to become us." No one slept that night, and above them, in the loft, a small trail of soot formed a single line, curved like a half-moon, drawn across the beam by an unseen hand. The 15th day dawned without light. It was not merely dim, it was dark. The kind of darkness that seemed to curl beneath the skin, as if the world had turned itself inside out during the night and forgotten how to right itself. Outside the shutters there was no sky, no suggestion of a sun behind cloud, only blackness, thick and unnatural. Inside the cottage the fire had burned low again. Not from lack of wood, Wilfred had kept it fed, watching it all night, but from something else. The flames had grown tired. They had begun to flicker low, no matter how much fuel was given, as though resisting the weight of the dark pressing against the walls. Ellen was the first to speak. "Something has taken the sun." Wilfred didn't question it. He only stood and placed another log into the hearth, this time not gently, but with force. The fire hissed in response, flared briefly, then dimmed again. Still alive, but weary. The children remained under the blankets, eyes wide, unmoving. They had woken to the blackness and said nothing. Not even Simon, who had spoken so often of it. Today his mouth remained closed. He curled against Marjorie's side, arms drawn tight around himself. There was no broth that morning. Ellen placed snow in the pot, but didn't light another flame. She knew it wouldn't boil. She could feel it in her hands. The heat was being watched now. Measured. Studied. "It's testing how long we'll stay warm," she said quietly. Wilfred knelt near the hearth and drew a new mark in the ash. It was not one passed down. It was instinct. A spiral with a broken tail surrounded by 4 dots. It felt right. It felt like something older than remembering. Then a sound came, not outside but from the ceiling. Not the usual creak of timber expanding, not the shifting of the thatch in wind. A voice. It was soft, close. It spoke a single word. "Marjorie." The girl froze. The others turned slowly, looking up toward the loft. Again the voice came. "Marjorie, let me in." The voice was hers. Exactly hers. A perfect mimicry, as if the wood above had learned to echo her childhood and was now offering it back to her like a puppet behind a curtain. Thomas reached for her hand, held it tightly. Ellen stood and took the old iron kettle from the wall. She didn't fill it. She didn't boil it. She placed it upside down, in the centre of the room, and lit a taper, then placed the flame beneath it. It was an old rite, not common, not even remembered properly. But it had meaning. An upside-down vessel, with fire beneath it, confused listening spirits. That's what her grandmother had once said. Things that are not meant to be invited will forget how to knock if they see a house turned inside out. The voice did not come again, but they could feel it, just above the rafters. Pressed low, spine flat against the thatch, listening. The rest of the day passed with no change in light. They moved through it as if trapped in a cave, measuring time by the turns of the fire and the hunger in their bellies. Wilfred took the spear and began carving symbols into the doorframe. His fingers bled as the blade slipped once, but he didn't flinch. The cuts formed crude shapes, triangles inside circles, lines that crossed without touching. He had never drawn them before, but his hands knew what to make. Outside, the wind returned, but not as a howl. It laughed. A low, breathy sound, weaving through the cracks in the shutters, curling beneath the door like smoke. It did not speak again, not with words, but it scraped. Fingers or claws traced along the boards, slow and deliberate. Sometimes on the roof, sometimes beneath the floor, sometimes right behind their heads. Thomas tried to follow it with his eyes, but the sound shifted too quickly. "It's learning the layout," he said suddenly, like a blind thing counting steps. Ellen nodded. "Then it mustn't hear ours." She instructed them all to walk only when the fire was loud, only when the logs cracked. Their steps became rituals tied to the rhythm of flame, and in the quiet between fire bursts they sat still, breathing only through their noses, not speaking, not remembering names aloud. At one point Simon stood again. He walked to the door and placed his hand on it. Wilfred moved to stop him, but Ellen raised her hand. "Let him." Simon pressed his forehead to the wood. Then he whispered, so faintly they barely caught it, "You don't belong to us." Nothing answered. He stepped back. But from outside, impossibly soft, came the sound of weeping. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, resigned sobs of something trying to sound human. Ida turned and buried her face in Marjorie's side. The older girl held her tightly, whispering into her hair. Ellen did not light another candle. Wilfred wrapped the spearhead in cloth, dipped it in ash, and set it beside him. And through the rest of the endless day, they sat surrounded by flickering flame and a darkness that did not move with the hours, because the hours had stopped, and something outside had begun counting its own. On the 16th day, they stopped calling it day at all. There was no difference between the hours anymore, only degrees of quiet. The fire had become their clock, its feeding, its dimming, the way its smoke coiled slowly upward before pressing down again like breath held too long. The snow had ceased falling 2 days ago, but the world outside remained smothered under its weight, sealed tight like a lid placed over the village. Inside the cottage, time thickened. Wilfred sat near the hearth, his eyes dry, blinking only when he remembered to. His hands had stopped trembling at some point during the night, but they hadn't warmed. He rubbed them together more out of habit than hope. The chill in his fingers no longer sharp, just deep. The kind of cold that didn't scream. It waited. Ellen was wrapping the children's feet again. Not with new cloth, but with rags rewrapped, rotated, turned inside out. She murmured instructions under her breath. Right foot, then left. Always tie at the ankle. Don't double the knot, it remembers knots. No one questioned her. The rules had changed, and no one could say when. Simon sat apart. He no longer moved like a child. His head remained tilted, listening. Not outward, but inward. As though the thing they feared had begun speaking from beneath his ribs, whispering into his spine. I heard it again, he said. His voice was distant, untroubled. Last night, underneath. Ellen froze. Underneath? Simon nodded. Under the floor, but not crawling, not scratching, just pressing. Wilfred turned slowly toward him. Pressing how? Like it's trying to remember how to be heavy. That was all he said. Then he curled back beneath his blanket, his face toward the wall, and began humming. Not the tuneless sound from before, but something with structure. A pattern. It didn't sound like a lullaby. It sounded like something copied. They didn't speak again for hours. Thomas had taken up the task of feeding the fire now. His movements had become precise, mechanical. He knew which logs burned loudest, which ones smoked, which ones cracked when split. He used only the ones that made noise. Noise was safety. Noise confused the thing outside. Or at least, it seemed to. The outside had begun tapping again, not consistently. It didn't knock anymore. It drummed. 3 taps, then 5, then 1, then 2. Always in new patterns. Testing. Searching. Once it scraped the wall in a slow circle. Marjorie had watched the motion with wide eyes, her lips forming the rhythm silently, memorizing it. It's spelling something, she whispered once. I think it's learning to write. Ellen placed a hand on her shoulder and said, Don't copy it. They burned the old stool that evening. It was too cold now to pretend they didn't need the extra fuel. Thomas split the legs with the axe, and Ellen lit the pieces slowly, letting each ignite before feeding the next. The fire blazed high, unnaturally bright for a few seconds, and for the first time in days, warmth touched the centre of the room. It was then that the knocking stopped. The outside went still. Even the wind that had curled through the cracks hushed. Silence fell with weight. They didn't move. Simon sat up. It's closer now. Ellen drew him in. Where? Simon touched his chest with both hands. Then pointed toward the chimney. Wilfred was already standing. He reached for the iron rod once used for stirring stew and moved toward the hearth. The flames leapt high, but there was no smoke. None. The fire burned, but nothing rose. Only light. Only heat. No ash lifted. No curl of grey. And then, from deep inside the chimney shaft came the sound of stone grinding slowly against stone. A slow descent. Ellen grabbed Ida, pulled her back. Marjorie clutched Thomas's hand. Wilfred raised the iron rod and placed it in the fire until it glowed red. Then he reached up, pressing the heated end into the mouth of the chimney just below the flue. There was a sound, not a scream, not a voice, just a recoil. The sound of something recognizing pain for the first time in a very long while. The chimney exhaled. Smoke belched out suddenly, thick and dark, curling around the room like a dying breath. The fire snapped twice, then returned to its usual rhythm. Wilfred backed away slowly, the iron rod now cooling, blackened. Simon exhaled. It was trying to come through, he said, but it didn't know how to fold yet. Ellen covered the chimney with an old wet cloth, tacking the corners in place with splinters of the burned stool. They didn't try to sleep that night. Instead, they told each other stories. Nothing grand, just scraps. Tales of summers they half remembered, of colours, of bread with butter, of the sound of bees. They spoke them into the air, not for comfort, but to occupy the space, to push out the silence, to remind the room of their voices, because the dark had a voice of its own, and tonight it almost spoken in fire. By the 17th day, the light had not returned. No dawn, no dusk, just the same flat black, the same relentless dark pressing in on every corner of Dunworth. It was no longer the absence of sun they feared, but the presence of something else. Something that came in the dark not because it needed it, but because it was it. Inside the cottage, they had stopped keeping track of hours. They measured time in firewood now. 1 log was 1 conversation. 2 was a silence. 3 meant sleep, if anyone could still find it. The children no longer asked questions. They moved in pairs, always touching. A hand on a shoulder, fingers entwined, knees pressed close together. There was safety in contact. The thing outside had not yet learned touch. Simon had begun whispering again, but only when he thought no one was listening. He muttered to the walls, to the floor, to the empty corners of the room. Ellen never stopped him. She watched him quietly, a hand resting on the pouch of salt that now hung from her belt. The salt had hardened in the pouch. It no longer spilled freely. It had become like rock, dense, reluctant to be used. As if it too had decided it wanted to stay. Wilfred had started marking the inside of the cottage with chalk, lines across the floorboards, circles around the windows, strange hatchings across the lower half of the door. He didn't say what they meant. Maybe he didn't know. But each mark brought a pause in the sounds outside. A beat of hesitation. That was enough. Thomas now sat close to the fire at all times, a wooden bowl in his lap and a small curved knife in hand. He carved over and over. Long sticks of firewood, small scraps of timber, even old utensils. Faces, mostly. Rough, primitive faces with wide open mouths. None of them smiled. None of them had eyes. He set them around the hearth like sentries. Marjorie had stopped humming, but she had begun writing. On scraps of cloth, the back of the old wool ledger, even in the soot that gathered on the hearth tiles. She wrote in symbols she claimed to have seen in dreams. Rows of tiny slashes, interlocking arcs, and spiral-shaped loops that doubled back on themselves like knots. They're locks, she said once, her voice thin, for words that shouldn't be said out loud. That day, they didn't cook. There was nothing left to cook with, and the fire had begun to resist even heat. It burned, yes, but not like it used to. It flickered like a flame unsure of itself, its glow muted, like light filtered through water. Ellen opened the hidden compartment beneath the sleeping straw. There, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a flat, brittle disc of dried meat, the last from autumn's hunt, a gift once saved for a birthing mother or a dying elder. It was neither feast nor comfort now, just necessity. She cut it into 7 pieces. No one complained about the size. They ate in silence. Simon didn't eat his. He held it, said, "It doesn't want us to eat." Wilfred leaned forward. "Why not?" Simon looked up slowly. "Because it's waiting for us to need it." No one responded. By what might have been nightfall, the cottage had begun to breathe. Not in the human way, but in the way a place begins to feel alive after enough things have listened to it. The walls creaked at even intervals. The chimney pulsed with warm air despite no change in flame. And the door shifted slightly every hour, as if something leaned on it to hear what they'd become. Wilfred checked the latch. The iron poker still held it closed, but the wood beneath it had begun to bend. The grain along the door's bottom edge now swirled in ways that didn't match its age, as if the door itself had been rewritten. That night, Simon said something they never forgot. He sat beside the fire, cross-legged, eyes reflecting the embers. "It knows we're almost out of stories." Ellen turned her head. "What do you mean?" Simon tilted his face toward the firelight. "It knows that once we stop remembering things, once we stop speaking them, it can make new ones for us." A log cracked, ash shifted. Outside, a faint chime rang out. It was not metallic. It sounded like a child's bell, the kind they tied to lambs in spring. but there were no lambs. Not in winter. Not now. Wilfred stood. He did not open the shutter, but he moved to the wall, pressed his palm against it, listened. From the other side, a low voice began to murmur, just on the edge of hearing, a prayer, or a lullaby, or the beginnings of a name. He pressed harder, and the voice stopped. Instead, something whispered back in a voice that sounded like his own. "Would you like to come out now?" He didn't reply. He stepped away, and the wall stayed warm for hours. No one slept that night, not truly. They took turns keeping the fire alive, and as the dark stretched on, deeper than time, longer than memory, they clung not to hope, but to ritual. Because hope was a story they were too tired to tell, but ritual still had weight, and the dark hadn't learned to carry it. Not yet. By the 18th day, the cottage had become more than a shelter. It was a threshold, a place caught between what was once life and what now circled outside in the dark. The walls creaked in rhythm. The air inside hung heavy and unmoving, and the light, though dim and flickering, still fought to keep its place. But something was different now. Not louder, not bolder, but closer. The dark had started to answer back. It spoke in ways not always heard, with movement just beyond the edges of sight, with sounds that arrived in mirrors of their own. If they whispered, it whispered back. If they waited in silence, it filled the silence with echoes. Wilfred sat in the middle of the room now, never far from the door, the fire behind him, the spear laid across his lap like a sleeping dog. He no longer watched the door. He listened to it. Not for knocks, not for voices, for breath. Ellen was boiling snow again, though they no longer drank it. The pot hung above the fire only to fill the air with steam, to keep the windows too clouded for anything to see clearly inside. She stirred it in slow circles, 3 turns clockwise, then 2 back, murmuring as she moved. Round, then back, then round again. Let no part of you remain unwound. It was an old spinning chant, but now it served a different purpose. The children had changed. They were not wild or loud, not sick, but they were quiet in a way that children should not be. Each of them had taken to one task and repeated it with quiet devotion. Thomas carved. He had nearly filled the wall behind the hearth with his crude wooden faces. Now he was making smaller ones, thin enough to be sewn into pockets, slipped into shoes, tied into braids. Protective, he said, to confuse whatever was watching. Marjorie wrote. She no longer needed ink or soot. She used ash from the hearth, rubbed into her fingertips. She smeared symbols onto bits of cloth, onto stones, even onto the underside of the table. At one point she pressed a mark onto her own chest, just beneath her collarbone, then covered it with a scarf and said nothing more. Ada tied knots, over and over. Loops, hitches, bends. She no longer untied them, just made more, stacking them on the floor beside her like a bundle of tangled thoughts. When asked why, she said, "If it can't untie, it can't pass." And Simon watched the corners. He no longer hummed, no longer whispered. He simply stared into corners, behind shadows, toward door frames. He sat still for long stretches, blinking only when touched. Sometimes his eyes followed something no one else could see. Ellen watched them all and said nothing. She only moved from child to child, touching shoulders, adjusting blankets, murmuring names. Always names. She had begun reciting them with a new cadence, slow and steady like prayers. Thomas, Marjorie, Edda, Simon. Thomas, Marjorie, Edda, Simon. Thomas, Marjorie, Edda, Simon. So they would not forget their order, their sound, their place. Because forgetting was dangerous now. Forget your name, and it might take it from you. Forget your voice, and it might give you another. Forget your shape, and it might fill it. That evening, as the fire sputtered low, a sound came from above. Different this time. Not a knock, not a step. A dragging, like something pulling itself across the thatch. Wilfred stood motionless. The dragging stopped. Then came a thud, soft but distinct, directly above the centre of the room. Simon said, "It's learning our roof." Ellen took the iron tongs from the hearth and placed them on the table. The gesture was not for defence, it was symbolic. A line drawn. Wilfred whispered, "It wants to come through something new." They all looked up. The rafters were low and dark. The small loft above them had been untouched for days. The children no longer slept there. The shadows gathered thickly in the corners. Marjorie rose. "I'll go up." Ellen moved quickly. "No." But Marjorie's face was calm. "If I don't look, it might choose." There was no debate. Not any more. Wilfred handed her a taper. Thomas gave her one of the carved faces. She climbed the ladder slowly, the wood groaning beneath her weight. At the top she paused. The loft was dark still, but not empty. She held the taper high. There against the far wall lay a shape. Not a body, not an object. A bundle of clothes, their clothes. Marjorie's shawl, Thomas's winter socks, Ada's ribbon, Wilfred's old work gloves, Simon's cap, folded, arranged, laid out like offerings. She did not scream. She descended slowly, holding the taper carefully, not speaking. When she reached the ground, she whispered, "It's copying us." Wilfred placed the iron poker back across the door. Ellen returned to the fire, stirring the pot without purpose. Thomas stacked 2 more faces near the hearth. Marjorie sat, arms crossed, not shivering, and Simon whispered, "It's almost ready." None of them asked, ready for what? They already knew. It was waiting for one of them to open something, anything, a door, a mouth, a memory. Because every night it came closer, and every night it looked more like home. By the 19th day, the air inside the cottage had turned heavy, as though it no longer wished to be breathed. The fire still burned, but it was a strained thing now, its light filtered and sluggish, like an old man trying to speak through sleep. The flames hissed occasionally, not from wet wood, but as if resisting something unseen. Ash drifted constantly, even when no one moved, coating the floor and clinging to skin. Outside, the snow hadn't changed, but the world beneath it had. Wilfred no longer checked the shutters. There was no point. Whatever watched no longer needed windows. Its presence had entered the wood itself. It shifted behind the walls like a memory out of reach, dragging itself between beams, nesting in the halls of the grain. The house still stood, but it no longer sheltered. Ellen felt it first. She was mixing a small pouch of dried herbs, juniper, valerian, and the last of the pennyroyal, when the scent changed. Her fingers stilled. She sniffed once. Then again it was her mother's soap, a smell she had not encountered in 10 winters, but strong now, unmistakable. Lavender and beeswax. The scent had no source, just was. She stood, walked toward the back wall. The smell was strongest near the floor. She knelt, placed her ear against the wood. Behind it, faint and wet, was breathing. Not rapid, not loud, just there. Simon turned from the hearth, his eyes already locked on her. "It found your name," he said softly. That was all. Wilfred moved to the wall and pressed a hand flat against it. The breathing stopped, but the wood pulsed once beneath his palm, like a muscle, then went still. Ellen did not speak again that hour. She returned to the herbs and burned the entire bundle in the fire, smoke rising in tight spirals. The flames licked high, then fell flat again, like something had sucked the air out of the room. Marjorie began pacing, whispering the spiral prayer she'd written in soot on the underside of the table. Ada huddled beside Thomas, her hands busy tying and untying the same piece of thread, her lips moving silently. Thomas held the latest of his carved faces, smaller now, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank round oval, smooth and warm from his palms. And Simon was looking at the ladder to the loft, not climbing it, not moving, just watching. Wilfred followed his gaze. "What is it?" Simon turned, voice distant. It moved the bundle. Ellen's hands clenched. "What do you mean? I saw it yesterday. The ribbon was on top. Now it's beneath the gloves." They didn't ask how he knew, or how he could see into the loft without climbing. He simply did. That night Ellen insisted they sleep in a circle, no backs turned, feet inward, heads out, a wheel of breath and warmth and human weight. "We're not just trying to stay warm anymore," she whispered to Wilfred. "We're trying to stay ourselves." No one argued. They laid down slowly, heads resting on arms, shoulders touching, knees drawn in close. The fire burned low but steady. Outside there were no footsteps, no knocking. But just after the last whisper had faded, there came a sound none of them had heard in days. A voice, clear, crisp. It came from just beyond the door. "Papa?" It was Ada's voice. But Ada was already curled beside Marjorie, fast asleep. Wilfred didn't move. The voice came again. "Papa, I'm cold." It was perfect, the same lilt, the same breathy tone, the same pause between words. Wilfred tightened his grip on the spear. Then came another voice. "Ellen?" It was his voice. "Let me in, I'm tired." Ellen's fingers curled into fists. No one moved, no one answered. The fire crackled once. Then came a third voice, this one low, heavy. "Wrong, I brought the sun." The room dropped into silence, so deep they could hear the firewood shrink. Ellen felt the weight of it behind the door. A smiling weight. She whispered to Wilfred, It's not trying to scare us anymore." He nodded once. "It wants to be believed." Outside, the voice began to sing, a lullaby none of them knew, but one that still pulled at something old and soft in the mind, like a dream from early childhood. They closed their eyes, held their breath, endured, and the song faded. Not because it ended, but because it sank, like a stone dropped into deep water. The fire burned until the logs curled into themselves. When it was gone, no one moved, because they could feel it now, no longer at the door or beneath the floor, but in the walls, waiting, learning to knock from the inside. By the 20th day, the cottage no longer creaked. It listened. The timbers had grown too still, too perfect in their silence. The usual ticks and groans of settling wood had vanished, replaced by an unnatural stillness that seemed to hush every breath, every footfall, even the quietest rustle of cloth. It was the kind of silence that held expectation. The kind that had started waiting for someone to make the first mistake. Wilfred woke first, not because of sound, but because of absence. The fire had gone out, not dimmed, not banked too low, gone. The ashes were cold, the coals dull and lifeless, and yet the air inside the room was not freezing. It was warm, but not from any source he could find. It was the wrong kind of warmth. The kind that feels like breath on the back of your neck in a room you thought was empty. He didn't move, not right away. Instead, he let his eyes adjust to the dark, such as it was. Shapes still stood where they should. The table, the cot, the row of carved faces Thomas had placed along the wall, the ladder to the loft, all untouched, all too untouched. He rose slowly, testing the floor with careful weight. The boards did not groan beneath him. They had stopped doing that 2 nights ago. He crossed to the hearth and reached down. The ashes crumbled like dry leaves, no ember, no heat. He looked to Ellen, who still slept, or appeared to. Her hand rested on Simon's shoulder, fingers splayed protectively. Thomas and Marjorie were curled together at the far end of the cot. Ada lay between them, her tiny feet tucked under her sister's cloak. None of them stirred. Wilfred stood and opened the cupboard by the wall, retrieving a stub of tallow candle and a flint. He struck the flint once, then twice. No spark. The third time, the stone cracked, split down the centre. He held both pieces in his palm, staring at them in disbelief. Then, behind him, a breath. Not his. Not human. He turned. Simon stood near the centre of the room. His eyes were open, wide. He hadn't made a sound. He was looking at the wall opposite the hearth, the one they'd stopped using, the one they'd painted with ash and salt and never touched again. There was now a crack in it, just one. Thin and pale and vertical. It hadn't been there before. Wilfred stepped forward. "Simon," he said quietly. The boy turned, but his eyes didn't follow. They stayed locked on the crack. "It's choosing now," he said. Ellen sat up then, her hands still on the ground where Simon had been. She blinked at the empty space, confused. Then she saw him. Then the crack. She did not scream. She rose and crossed the room, stepping between Simon and the wall, placing herself in front of it like a shield. Wilfred joined her, spear in hand. Marjorie woke next. Then Thomas. Then Ada, who opened her eyes and immediately began to weep. Not loudly, not even in fear. Just quiet, steady tears, as if she'd seen something in her dreams that refused to let go. Ellen reached down, touched the crack. It was smooth, too smooth, like skin pulled too tight over bone. Thomas brought one of the blank faces he had carved and placed it at the base of the wall. No ceremony, no explanation. Then he turned to the others. "I think it's a mirror," he said. Simon shook his head. "No, it's a mouth." No one asked how he knew. The crack did not widen. It just remained, there in the wood, waiting. That morning, or what they still called morning, Ellen prepared the last bundle of herbs. She didn't boil them. She burned them dry, letting the smoke fill the room, thick and stinging. She paced slowly, whispering, waving the smoke into corners, into the loft, into the chimney mouth, into the dark. Wilfred did not eat. There was nothing left, and even if there had been, the hunger no longer mattered. What they feared now had nothing to do with the body. Marjorie returned to her writing, this time pressing symbols onto her own skin, small marks along the wrist, behind the ears, across the shoulder blade, silent messages to whatever was watching. "I see you seeing me." Thomas kept carving, but now each face had eyes, closed, no mouths. Ada slept most of the day, her small hands twitching as if tying knots in dreams. When she woke, she whispered, "It's under the table." They checked. There was nothing there. But when Wilfred placed his hand on the underside of the wood, it came back warm. Simon, who hadn't spoken in hours, finally said, "It's waiting for us to ask it in." Ellen crouched beside him. "Then we won't," she said. But Simon only stared at the wall. "You already did." That night the fire refused to light, even with dry kindling, even with breath and flint and blessing. The wood smoked, then turned black, then cold. And the crack in the wall, just slightly, just once, breathed. The room filled with the scent of something familiar, not foul, not alien. Home. The scent of sun-warmed linen and oven bread and summer dust. It was trickery, but it was powerful. Marjorie began to cry, shoulders trembling, hands over her ears. Thomas gripped his knees. Edda whispered a song no one had taught her, and Simon stood in the dark facing the crack, his face unreadable. "It doesn't want to take us," he said. "It wants us to give ourselves." Ellen held her breath, and the room held its shape, but barely. Outside, the dark no longer waited. It watched, pressing in around the house like hands against glass, fingers curled, breath slow. It had found its way through the snow, through the wind, through wood and whisper. Now it needed only one thing, a voice, a yes, a single misstep in the dark. On the 21st day, there was a sound like paper tearing, slow and deep. It came just before what might have been morning, if morning still had meaning. The sound moved through the beams of the cottage, not from above or below, but through, as if something had caught the walls in its grip and gently pulled them apart, strand by strand. No one was sleeping. Sleep had become too thin. They all heard it. Wilfred rose without a word, his hands already closing around the haft of the spear. Ellen sat up slowly, placing a hand on Simon's chest. He was awake, of course. He hadn't closed his eyes in hours. The crack in the wall had widened. Not by much, an inch, perhaps less, but it was no longer a line. It was a slit, a suggestion, the faintest shape of a door that had forgotten how to open. There was no light within it, just a stillness that invited. Thomas approached it first. He held a new carving. This one was different. Not a face, but a figure. A small hunched form with no head and arms crossed over its chest. He placed it at the base of the crack and stepped back. Simon watched closely. His lips parted slightly, as if about to say something, then closed again. He shook his head. "It doesn't want offerings anymore." "What does it want?" Marjorie asked. He turned to her slowly, to finish what it started. Ida began to cry then, not from fear, not from pain, but from a terrible recognition. She pointed toward the hearth. The fire had returned, not as flame, but as glow, pale, soft, pulsing from the cold ashes. A shape inside, a small one. Ellen moved first, crossed the room and knelt beside it. She reached into the ashes slowly, careful not to scatter them. Her hand emerged holding something round and smooth. A stone, but not from the hearth, not from anywhere near. It was river stone, grey with a single white band across the centre. She held it in her palm, staring. "It was mine," she whispered, "from when I was a girl. I lost it when I was 9, dropped it in the river near the bridge." No one spoke. Wilfred looked from the stone to the crack, and understood. "It's returning things," he said, "things we forgot, things we let go." Ellen closed her hand around the stone. "Why?" Simon answered, his voice distant. "Because it needs you to recognize it." Recognition, memory, consent. They were not so different now. The dark had grown clever. It no longer begged to be let in. It simply reminded them it had always been near. That evening, they gathered around the hearth, though there was no fire. Only the fading glow of the remembered stone, now resting in a bowl beside a coil of ash. Ellen took the spoon and stirred snow into the pot, even knowing it wouldn't boil. "Keep the motion," she murmured, "so it doesn't think we've stopped trying." The children nodded. Marjorie resumed her writing, this time in circles, endless spirals scrawled into the bottom of a wooden plate. Thomas carved with shaking hands, a face smaller than any before, a child's face. Edda hummed quietly, no melody, just breath moving through her lips, and Simon. Simon stood by the wall, staring into the crack. The glow had shifted, no longer pale, now red, like sunset through a stained window. "Simon," Wilfred said, "step away." But the boy didn't. He raised his hand, not to touch the crack, but to mimic it. Fingers held straight, palm toward the seam. On the other side, a second hand appeared, matching his. No sound, no scrape, just the image. Simon didn't move. Ellen stepped forward slowly. The second hand mirrored her too. as if there were versions of them folded just beyond the wood, watching, learning, waiting to be named. Simon spoke again, softly. "It's almost finished building us." "What happens then?" Wilfred asked. Simon looked over his shoulder. "It doesn't want to replace us." He turned back to the wall. "It wants to step inside our lives like a coat." That night they did not lay down to sleep. They sat in a ring facing outward. The fire never rose, the wind never blew, the house didn't creak, but the crack pulsed, once every hour, as if it had grown a heartbeat, and still the stone in the bowl stayed warm. Wilfred kept the spear beside him, though he now doubted it would matter. Ellen held Edda and recited their names in order. Thomas carved, Marjorie wrote, Simon watched, and all of them together waited for a day that might never come, because the dark had remembered them too well, and was almost ready to speak their names back. By the 22nd day, the darkness had learned how to breathe, not just in sound but in rhythm, slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to stretch the walls of the cottage with each pause, then press inward again as if the air itself had turned animate. It was not wind. Wind passed through things. This moved within them. The crack in the wall had grown. It now spanned from floor to ceiling, still narrow, still closed, but wider than a finger's width in places. The wood around it had softened, its grain smoothed to a skin-like sheen, and it pulsed, once every few minutes, with a faint inward pull, like a breath drawn slowly through lips held barely open. Wilfred had stopped trying to reinforce it. There were no nails strong enough, no salt thick enough, no symbols obscure enough to slow its progress. Instead, he simply watched. Ellen spent the morning weaving, not fabric, but pattern. She tore strips from the old bedding and began braiding them, knotting them in spirals, laying them across the thresholds, over the windows, along the base of the loft ladder. She murmured softly as she worked, saying things in a language none of the children had learned. Fragments of old charms passed to her when she was a girl, remembered only in moments when memory stood between life and vanishing. 3 knots to keep the voice away, 4 to bind the mouth, 5 to keep the eyes from waking. She wrapped the last strip around the base of the hearthstone, not to keep something out, to keep them in, because that was the temptation now, not fear. Relief. The crack had changed its tone. It no longer whispered hunger or cold or fear. It began to offer. Marjorie was the first to hear it. She had been writing again, this time on the inside of the cupboard door where she kept her symbols hidden. The air around her had gone very still. Then she looked up, eyes wide, face blank. "It said my name," she whispered. Not aloud, not with sound, but I felt it say me. Ellen crossed the room, took her daughter's hands, pressed their foreheads together. "What did it offer you?" Marjorie blinked once. A room with a window, green outside, a field. I could hear bees. Someone was calling me for supper. Wilfred's jaw clenched. He turned to Thomas. "Have you heard it too?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "It showed me a dog I had, when I was small, before it ran off. I could hear it barking again, just past the trees." He swallowed hard. "It was my bark, but it wasn't my dog." They didn't need to ask Simon. He sat at the base of the crack now, facing it. Not touching it, but near, always near. "It's practicing," he said quietly. "It's nearly fluent." "What do you mean?" Wilfred asked. Simon turned his head just slightly, enough for one eye to meet his father's. "It's learned how to speak in memories, not voices, not dreams, but things we miss, things we almost forgot." He placed a hand on the floor beside him. "Soon it won't have to ask anymore. It will just remind." That night they didn't speak after dark. Not for superstition, for protection, because even words now had weight. Even the wrong syllable might be taken up, learned, echoed. At one point, Edda reached out for her mother in her sleep. Her fingers brushed the wall behind her cot, and the crack shivered, just once, a tiny tremble. But it was enough. Ellen pulled Edda close, wrapped her in every scrap of cloth they had left, and didn't let her touch the floor again until morning. The carved faces Thomas had placed around the room had begun to decay. Not rot. The once clear features softened. Eyes melted into cheeks, noses collapsed, mouths flattened. By morning, none of them had identity, only shape. Thomas gathered them in a cloth and buried them beneath the hearthstone. Too close, he said. It was learning from them. Simon hadn't moved in hours, still at the crack, still listening. Ellen placed a bundle of sage near him, burned it slowly, wafting the smoke around his shoulders. But he didn't blink. Then, sometime in the deepest part of the night, what they had once called 3 or 4 bells, the crack opened slightly. No more than a sliver. But this time, there was light. Not warm, not cold, just the suggestion of something behind. Not emptiness, not void, but a room. A room with a table, a bowl, a chair, and someone sitting in it. Wilfred saw it first, then Ellen, then Marjorie. The shape inside looked up. It did not wave, it did not call, but it smiled, with a face that was not Wilfred's, but very nearly, just smooth younger, slightly wrong around the eyes. Simon stood and smiled back. Ellen rose sharply. "Don't speak," she hissed, but it was too late. Simon pressed his palm to the air near the crack, and the shape on the other side did the same. The room pulsed once. The fire flickered, though it had not been lit. And from the crack, a breath escaped, not cold, not hot, but familiar. The scent of summer rain on stone. Wilfred stepped forward, placing himself between Simon and the wall. Simon blinked. "I didn't say anything." Wilfred shook his head. "You didn't have to." Because the thing behind the crack already knew their faces, their voices, their memories, and now it was learning their restraint. It was nearly done waiting. By the 23rd day, the cottage had become quieter than death. Even breath was borrowed now, drawn only when necessary and exhaled like apology. The air had grown thick with silence, not empty, but occupied. Something had settled into it, a presence no longer knocking or whispering or calling. It had no need for invitation anymore. The crack in the wall had stopped growing. It didn't need to widen further. It had already done what it came to do. It had learned the shape of their voices, the scent of their fear, the cadence of their silence. It had studied them night by night until even the way they shivered belonged to it. The opening now shimmered faintly, not with light, but with memory. When they looked at it, they saw fragments, not directly, not like looking through a window, but as if seeing reflections in rippled water. Marjorie saw her own handwriting, repeated and perfect, curling along the walls of a room she didn't recognize. Thomas saw faces, his carvings, but they blinked now, and their mouths opened in sync, as if whispering secrets to each other. Ada saw ropes tied in loops she never learned, twisted into impossible braids that formed words when she stared long enough. And Simon. Simon had stopped sitting near the crack. He stood in the corner now, unmoving, not facing the wall, but the room, watching them all. His eyes were calm, unblinking. "It doesn't need to look through anymore," he said. "It's looking out." Wilfred had nailed every board he could find across the windows. It hadn't made a difference. The light that filtered through the crack was not affected by barriers. It was not subject to wood or glass or night. It obeyed only recognition. It grew stronger the more they understood it. Ellen no longer burned herbs. She had turned to binding spells now, threads and iron nails driven into the floor at each corner of the cottage, tied together by knotted cords looped 3 times, twisted in silence. The air smelled of scorched cloth and rusted metal. She carried Simon's old toy, a wooden sheep with one missing leg, as a token of before, a thing untouched by the dark. But even it had grown warmer to the touch. Thomas sat by the hearth, carving nothing now, only holding the knife, watching the glow. "I think it's inside the fire," he said once. "No," Marjorie replied. "It's inside what we thought the fire was." Ada had stopped speaking altogether. She communicated now in gestures, taps of fingers, small braided cords placed in people's hands. She tied one around Wilfred's wrist and nodded once, firmly. A warning. When night came, which was not night anymore, but only a deepening, the crack pulsed twice. And then, from somewhere inside the room, a second crack appeared on the opposite wall, smaller, thinner, but there. They hadn't heard it form. It had not groaned or split. It had simply arrived, as if invited by the first. Simon turned slowly to look at it, then at them. "It's replicating," he said. "Every time we resist, it copies the shape of resistance." Ellen stepped back. "Then we can't fight it." Simon shook his head, not with defiance, not with silence, not even with love. He turned back toward the first crack. His voice was lower now. "It already has all of that. It took them while we slept." They sat in a circle again as they had before, but this time something was different. The room was no longer theirs, not completely. The air inside felt hollow, like a house stripped of its furniture, its soul. The space had been measured, catalogued, prepared. Then at the height of that long hour the cracks sang, both of them, softly humming, low and full of breath. Notes that resonated not in the ears but in the bones. It was not melody, it was memory. A hum from some moment long buried. Thomas dropped the knife. Marjorie began to mouth the hum in perfect time. Ellen clapped her hands once, loud. Both children blinked, pulled back. "It's not muse," she said, "it's reminding your bones what they've forgotten." Wilfred rose to his feet, spear in hand. His eyes were wild now. Not afraid, but full of that strange defiance only desperation can birth. "We leave," he said. Everyone turned to him. "We go, we walk, I don't care where." No one moved. No one answered. Because outside, beyond the sealed windows, there were no sounds, no wind, no birds, no shifting snow. The world had stopped. Not because it was empty, because it was listening too. And somewhere behind those cracks something smiled with their teeth and waited for them to ask, "What if it's better on the other side?" By the 23rd day, the cottage had become quieter than death. Even breath was borrowed now, drawn only when necessary and exhaled like apology. The air had grown thick with silence, not empty, but occupied. Something had settled into it. A presence no longer knocking or whispering or calling. It had no need for invitation anymore. The crack in the wall had stopped growing. It didn't need to widen further. It had already done what it came to do. It had learned the shape of their voices, the scent of their fear, the cadence of their silence. It had studied them night by night, until even the way they shivered belonged to it. The opening now shimmered faintly, not with light, but with memory. When they looked at it, they saw fragments, not directly, not like looking through a window, but as if seeing reflections in rippled water. Marjorie saw her own handwriting, repeated and perfect, curling along the walls of a room she didn't recognize. Thomas saw faces, his carvings, but they blinked now, and their mouths opened in sync as if whispering secrets to each other. Ada saw ropes tied in loops she never learned, twisted into impossible braids that formed words when she stared long enough. And Simon had stopped sitting near the crack. He stood in the corner now, unmoving, not facing the wall but the room, watching them all. His eyes were calm, unblinking. "It doesn't need to look through anymore," he said. "It's looking out." Wilfred had nailed every board he could find across the windows. It hadn't made a difference. The light that filtered through the crack was not affected by barriers. It was not subject to wood or glass or night. It obeyed only recognition. It grew stronger the more they understood it. Ellen no longer burned herbs. She had turned to binding spells now, threads and iron nails driven into the floor at each corner of the cottage, tied together by knotted cords looped 3 times, twisted in silence. The air smelled of scorched cloth and rusted metal. She carried Simon's old toy, a wooden sheep with one missing leg, as a token of before, a thing untouched by the dark, but even it had grown warmer to the touch. Thomas sat by the hearth, carving nothing now, only holding the knife, watching the glow. "I think it's inside the fire," he said once. "No," Marjorie replied. "It's inside what we thought the fire was." Ada had stopped speaking altogether. She communicated now in gestures, taps of fingers, small braided cords placed in people's hands. She tied one around Wilfred's wrist and nodded once firmly, a warning. When night came, which was not night anymore but only a deepening, the crack pulsed twice. And then, from somewhere inside the room, a second crack appeared, on the opposite wall, smaller, thinner. But there, they hadn't heard it form. It had not groaned or split, it had simply arrived, as if invited by the first. Simon turned slowly to look at it, then at them. "It's replicating," he said. "Every time we resist, it copies the shape of resistance." Ellen stepped back. "Then we can't fight it?" Simon shook his head. Not with defiance, not with silence, not even with love. He turned back toward the first crack. His voice was lower now. "It already has all of that. It took them while we slept." They sat in a circle again, as they had before, but this time something was different. The room was no longer theirs. Not completely. The air inside felt hollow, like a house stripped of its furniture, its soul. The space had been measured, catalogued, prepared. Then at the height of that long hour, the cracks sang, both of them, softly, a humming, low and full of breath. Notes that resonated not in the ears, but in the bones. It was not melody, it was memory, a hum from some moment long buried. Thomas dropped the knife. Marjorie began to mouth the hum in perfect time. Ellen clapped her hands once, loud. Both children blinked, pulled back. "It's not music," she said. "It's reminding your bones what they've forgotten." Wilfred rose to his feet, spear in hand. His eyes were wild now, not afraid, but full of that strange defiance only desperation can birth. "We leave," he said. Everyone turned to him. "We go, we walk, I don't care where." No one moved, no one answered. Because outside, beyond the sealed windows, there were no sounds, no wind, no birds, no shifting snow. The world had stopped, not because it was empty, because it was listening too. And somewhere behind those cracks, something smiled with their teeth and waited for them to ask, "What if it's better on the other side?"